A Christmas Homecoming. A Winter Brothers of Palmar Island Romance. Written by Susanne Ash. Chapter 1. The gravel crunched under James Winter's tires as he guided his BMW 7 Series down the familiar drive of the family farm. The luxury sedan felt out of place here among the work trucks and farm equipment, much like he did these days. But after 15 years of building a successful law practice in Birmingham, certain habits were hard to break. December twilight had settled over Palmar Island, painting the old buildings in shades of purple and gold. The farmhouse stood dark and quiet, unusual for this time of evening, especially so close to Christmas. He'd told Ethan he'd be home for Christmas, though he hadn't mentioned his last-minute decision to come a few days early. The weight of his empty apartment, the echoing silence of his corner office, had finally become too much. He needed something. Home, maybe. Family. The simple certainty that had always filled this place that had housed generations of winters. The farmhouse stood dark against the purple-gold sky, no warm light spilling from its windows, no Christmas decorations twinkling in welcome. Strange. He knew his parents were on a Caribbean cruise, a 40th anniversary gift from their sons, but Ethan and Olivia should be here. His brother had mentioned something about nesting, about getting the house ready for their soon-to-arrive first child. James cut the engine, letting the silence settle around him. No traffic noise, no endless stream of notifications from his phone, just the whisper of wind through pine trees and the distant sound of waves breaking against the shore. The contrast with his usual life felt sharp enough to cut. The key was still where it had always been, tucked behind the loose brick near the porch steps. Some things never changed on Palmar Island, even when everything else did. The door creaked open, familiar yet somehow wrong in the darkness. "Hello?" His voice echoed through the empty house. "Ethan? Olivia?" Only silence answered. James fumbled for the light switch, illuminating a kitchen that looked frozen in time. Coffee mug sat unwashed in the sink, a half-empty pot still on the warmer. His mother's cookie jar stood open on the counter, Christmas treats scattered nearby as if someone had left in a hurry. The living room held the same sense of interrupted life, a book lay open on the sofa, a coffee mug half-empty sat on the side table, a throw blanket hung crumpled nearby. The Christmas tree stood dark and unfinished, boxes of ornaments waiting to be hung. Something wasn't right. Ethan was methodical about the farm's routines and everything else in his life. He'd never leave things undone like this. Worry crept up James's spine as he moved through the quiet house, each room holding memories that felt both comforting and accusatory. When was the last time he'd been home for more than a flying visit? Movement caught his eye through the window, a flash of light from the direction of the barn. James frowned, checking his watch. Nearly 7 o'clock. Too late for the usual evening chores, especially with the early winter darkness. He grabbed his coat from where he'd draped it over a kitchen chair and stepped out into the crisp December air. His leather shoes, perfectly suited for Birmingham's law offices, crunched against frozen grass as he made his way across the farmyard. The temperature had dropped sharply since sunset, his breath visible in pale clouds under the yellow security light mounted high on a pole between the house and barn. Despite his years away, his feet knew this path, could have walked it blindfolded, past the old oak tree, around the feed shed, careful of the dip in the ground that always collected water or ice depending on the season. The barn door stood partially open, warm light spilling onto the frozen ground. As James approached, he heard a low, rhythmic humming mixed with gentle words of encouragement. It was a woman's voice, unfamiliar but calm. Inside, the barn was warm and hay-scented, lights strung along the rafters casting everything in a gentle glow. A woman knelt beside one of the cows. Her back was to him, chestnut hair falling in a practical braid, and she wore a heavy canvas coat with Walker Veterinary Services embroidered across the shoulders. "You're doing great, sweet girl," she murmured, running a practiced hand along the cow's flank. "Just a little longer now." "Everything okay?" James asked quietly, not wanting to startle either the cow or her caretaker. The woman turned, revealing striking hazel eyes and a face that managed to be both professionally composed and naturally warm. "Oh. I didn't hear you come in." She rose smoothly to her feet, wiping her hands on a towel tucked into her belt. I'm Dr. Sarah Walker, the island's vet. And you are? James Winter. This is my family's farm. He moved closer, drawn by the obvious concern in her expression. I was looking for my brother, actually. The house is empty. Ah. Understanding flickered across her face. Ethan took Olivia to the hospital about an hour ago. The babies decided to make an early appearance. James's heart jumped into his throat. His first niece or nephew, coming weeks ahead of schedule. Images of hospital corridors and worried faces flashed through his mind, memories of when their mother had struggled with Daniel's early delivery. Everything seems fine, just unexpected, Dr. Walker added quickly, her voice gentle but assured. I was here checking on Betsy when they left, she's close to delivering too. Ethan asked me to keep an eye on things until they could get back. James absorbed the information, feeling both relieved and somehow more untethered. He'd driven all this way seeking the comfort of family, only to find an empty house and a stranger in the barn. Yet watching Sarah tend to Betsy with such practiced care, her movements both confident and gentle, he felt some of his earlier tension ease. There was something reassuring about her calm presence in the familiar space of his family's barn. Can I help, Dr. Walker? He offered, shrugging off his suit jacket and rolling up his sleeves. The expensive fabric felt ridiculous here among the hay and warm animal bodies, but the vet didn't seem to notice or care about his city attire. Call me Sarah and, yes. She nodded toward a stack of fresh straw. Could you refresh her bedding while I check her progress? She's been restless, and I want her to be as comfortable as possible. Mind handing me that towel? Sarah asked, checking Betsy's temperature with practiced efficiency. James passed her the clean towel from her medical kit, impressed by how methodically she worked. They'd fallen into an easy rhythm over the past half hour, him anticipating her needs, while she monitored the cow's condition. Everything looks stable, she said, making notes in a small leather-bound notebook. Betsy's comfortable, but we'll need to keep an eye on her through the night. Why don't you take a few minutes to call your brother? I've got things covered here. James nodded, grateful for the suggestion. He'd been fighting the urge to check his phone, not wanting to appear distracted from helping her. You're sure? Go, Sarah said with a gentle smile. I think we both know you won't relax until you hear how Olivia's doing. James stepped outside to make the call, his back against the rough barn wood. The phone rang twice before Ethan answered, his brother's voice tight with worry. James? Everything okay? Ethan's voice was tight with worry. Yes, I'm at the farm. Found Dr. Walker in the barn instead of you and Olivia. What's happening? Wait, you're here? Already? The surprise momentarily overtook the tension in Ethan's voice. I thought you weren't coming until next week. Change of plans. James watched his breath cloud in the cold air. Left Birmingham this morning. Didn't think to call ahead. How's Olivia? Everything okay with the baby? A long exhale crackled through the line. She started having contractions this afternoon. We thought it was just practice ones, Braxton Hicks, you know? But they got stronger, more regular. There was a rustling sound, like Ethan was moving through a hospital corridor. The doctors are trying to stop the labor. Give the baby a little more time. How far along is she? James heard the strain in his own voice, memories of their mother's difficult pregnancies surfacing unbidden. 34 weeks. Ethan's voice wavered slightly. They say that's better than it could be, but still. He trailed off, and James could picture his younger brother pacing the sterile hospital halls, shoulders tight with tension. Do you need anything? I could come. No, stay at the farm. Someone needs to be there, and Dr. Walker can't handle everything alone. The sound of a door opening, voices in the background. I should go. They're coming to check on Olivia again. Keep me posted, James said, but Ethan had already hung up. The night air felt colder now, or maybe it was just the worry settling into his bones. James took a moment to collect himself before heading back into the barn's warmth. Sarah looked up from where she was checking Betsy's vitals, reading his expression with those keen hazel eyes. How are they doing? Doctors are trying to stop the labor. James ran a hand through his hair, realizing too late it probably still had hay on it. Ethan sounds pretty shaken up. How far along is Olivia? Sarah's voice held professional interest layered with genuine concern. 34 weeks. Is that, I don't know much about, he gestured vaguely, feeling out of his depth. In a courtroom, James always knew exactly what to say, but here, surrounded by life and its complications, words failed him. That's actually not bad, Sarah said, her calm confidence steadying him. Modern medicine has come a long way. At 34 weeks, the baby's lungs are nearly mature. If the doctors can't stop the labor, there are medications to help with development. She smiled softly. Trust me, I've delivered plenty of calves earlier than their due dates. Nature has a way of working things out. Is that what you're expecting with Betsy? James asked, grateful for the slight change in subject. She's right on schedule, actually. Should be sometime in the next day or two. Sarah patted the cow's flank affectionately. She's an old pro at this. Fourth calf. They worked together for another hour, James finding himself increasingly aware of Sarah's presence. She moved with quiet confidence, explaining Betsy's vital signs and what to watch for, her voice warm and engaging. When she reached up to adjust one of the heat lamps, a loose strand of hair fell from her braid, catching the golden light. James had to force himself to look away, surprised by the sudden urge to tuck it back behind her ear. This wasn't what he needed right now. He hadn't come home to be distracted by an attractive woman, no matter how capable and intelligent she seemed. Yet he couldn't help noticing the grace in her movements, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled, how her presence made the barn feel less empty. Could you check her water? Sarah asked, breaking into his thoughts. We want to make sure she stays hydrated. James welcomed the task, grateful for something to focus on besides his unexpected reaction to the island's veterinarian. They worked in companionable silence, moving around each other with an ease that seemed impossible given they'd just met. Every so often, their hands would brush as they passed tools back and forth, each contact sending a jolt of awareness through him that he tried his best to ignore. I think we're good here, Sarah said finally, closing her medical bag. She's comfortable, no signs of immediate labor. I'll come back first thing in the morning to check on her. James nodded, suddenly reluctant to see this peaceful interlude end. They stood together watching the animals, the barn quiet except for soft breathing and the occasional rustle of hay. A barn owl called somewhere in the distance, its cry carrying clearly through the winter night. James was acutely aware of Sarah beside him, the subtle scent of her shampoo mixing with the earthier smells of the barn. It's different here, isn't it? Sarah's voice was soft, understanding. When she turned to look at him, the Christmas lights caught the gold flecks in her hazel eyes. From the city, I mean. Took me months to get used to it after Atlanta. Different, James agreed, thinking of his gleaming office 40 stories above Birmingham streets, all chrome and glass and sharp edges. Everything here was softer somehow, warmer. Or maybe that was just Sarah's presence. But familiar too, somehow. Like muscle memory. The farm has that effect. She smiled, and James felt that smile like a physical thing, warming him despite the December chill. It remembers you, even if you think you've forgotten it. They did one final check on Betsy before heading toward the barn door. Sarah paused to adjust the heat lamp one last time, and James found himself watching the graceful movement of her hands, the confident way she handled every task. The thought of returning to the empty farmhouse alone suddenly seemed unnecessarily bleak. Try not to worry too much about Olivia and the baby, she said gently. The hospital in Charleston has an excellent NICU, and 34 weeks is better than you're thinking. Focus on taking care of things here. That's what Ethan needs right now. He nodded, grateful for her steady presence in what had turned out to be a far more complicated homecoming than he'd expected. Thank you. For everything tonight. That's what neighbors do here, Sarah said simply. In that case, he said with a sincerity that surprised him. I'm glad you're one of them. I should get going, Sarah said, reaching for her medical bag. I'll be back first thing in the morning to check on her. James glanced at his watch, surprised to find it was barely past 8. Despite everything, the long drive from Birmingham, the worry about Olivia and the baby, he wasn't ready for this evening to end. Before he could overthink it, he heard himself say, I was thinking about putting together some dinner. Nothing fancy, but you're welcome to join me. The invitation hung in the air between them as they stepped out into the crisp December night. Chapter 2. I should check on the other animals first, Sarah found herself saying, surprising them both. She knew she should leave, but something in his expression made it impossible to walk away. Make sure everyone's settled for the night. I can handle the chores, James said. I did grow up here, after all. Yes, but I promised Ethan I'd keep an eye on things. Sarah shifted her medical bag to her other shoulder. I take my promises seriously, especially to people who trust me with their animals. James studied her for a moment, and Sarah tried not to notice how the barn lights caught the silver threading through his dark hair at the temples. Then let me make you dinner afterward, he said finally. It's the least I can do for keeping you out here so late. He paused, something uncertain flickering across his face. Unless you have someone waiting at home? Heat crept into Sarah's cheeks, and she was grateful for the dim lighting. No, just my cat, Magnus. He's used to my irregular hours. Then it's settled. A genuine smile spread across James's face, transforming his features from merely handsome to something that made Sarah's breath catch. I make a mean cheese omelette. It's pretty much the only thing I still remember how to cook, but I do it well. A cheese omelette, huh? Sarah stepped back into the barn, aware of James's presence as he followed close behind. His hand brushed her lower back as he reached past her to hold the door, a casual touch that felt anything but. You sound pretty confident. My mother taught me well before I left for college, he said, his voice low and close to her ear. Some things you don't forget. The warmth of his breath against her neck sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the December chill. Sarah moved quickly toward the feed room, needing some distance. This attraction was unexpected and unwelcome. She had a good life here on the island, a purpose. The last thing she needed was to fall for someone who'd be gone as soon as the holidays were over. They worked efficiently, falling back into the easy rhythm they'd developed over the past couple of hours. Sarah found herself watching him when she thought he wasn't looking, the way his expensive suit shirt stretched across his shoulders as he hefted hay bales, how naturally he moved among the animals despite his years away. There was something compelling about seeing this clearly successful man doing manual labor without complaint. You're good with them, she commented as he gentle-handled one of the younger goats. It's obvious you grew up here. It's coming back to me. Though I have to admit, these aren't exactly my usual barn clothes, James said, glancing down at his dress shirt and leather shoes with a self-deprecating smile. Sarah laughed, the sound echoing in the quiet barn. I don't think the goats mind what you're wearing, as long as you keep the hay coming. No? His eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, a real smile this time, not the polite one he'd worn earlier. And here I was trying so hard to impress them. The banter felt dangerous, too easy and natural. Sarah busied herself with checking water levels, trying to maintain some professional distance. But as they walked toward the farmhouse, she couldn't help noticing how he automatically shortened his stride to match hers, or the way he placed himself between her and the icy patch near the porch steps. The kitchen looked like someone had left in a hurry, coffee mug sitting in the sink, scattered Christmas cookies on the counter, the coffee pot still half full on the warmer. James cleared his throat. I should probably clear the counters first. I can help. Sarah pushed up her sleeves. Have a seat, James said, then glanced down at his dusty clothes. Actually, let me wash up and change first. Make yourself at home. I should probably clean up too, Sarah said. There's a bathroom down the hall, James called over his shoulder, before rushing upstairs. Sarah nodded gratefully. After hours in the barn, she could use a moment to collect herself. In the small downstairs bathroom, she unwound her braid, grimacing at her reflection. Hay dust had settled in her hair, and there was a suspicious smudge on her sweater that was probably courtesy of Betsy. She did her best to clean it with a damp towel while letting her hair fall in waves around her shoulders. What was she doing here? Having dinner with James Winter hadn't been part of her evening plans. Yet here she was, fussing with her appearance like this was more than a neighborly meal. When she emerged, James had changed into jeans and a soft-looking gray sweater that made him look less like a Birmingham lawyer and more like he belonged on the farm. He was rolling up his sleeves as he moved toward the refrigerator. "Ready for that omelet I promised you?" "Absolutely," Sarah said, trying not to notice how the casual clothes suited him, softening his city polish into something more approachable. "Need any help?" "You've been taking care of the farm and animals. Let me handle this." He pulled out eggs, cheese, and various vegetables with surprising confidence, then paused. "Though I wouldn't say no if you wanted to make coffee." "That I can do." Sarah moved to the coffee maker, grateful for a task. The familiar routine helped settle her nerves as James began whisking eggs with practiced ease. "So tell me," he said, dicing peppers with unexpected skill, "how does an Atlanta vet end up on Palmar Island?" Sarah measured coffee grounds, considering her answer. "I got tired of treating pets like accessories," she said finally. "Of owners who cared more about convenience than care. Here, animals are part of people's livelihoods, their families. It matters more, somehow." James was quiet for a moment, just the sound of eggs sizzling between them. "I think I understand that better than I would have yesterday." Something in his tone made her look up. He was focused on the omelet, but his expression was thoughtful, almost vulnerable. Sarah busied herself with mugs and cream, trying to ignore how right it felt, the two of them moving around the kitchen together. "Your turn," she said, needing to shift the focus away from herself. "What brings a successful lawyer home early for Christmas?" His hand stilled briefly over the skillet before he resumed cooking. "Would you believe me if I said I missed the farm?" "Actually, yes." Sarah leaned against the counter, cradling her coffee mug. "I've seen how natural you are with the animals, despite being away so long. Some things are just in your blood." James's lips curved into a small smile as he expertly folded cheese into the omelet. "Maybe. Or maybe I just needed." He trailed off, concentrating on sliding the first perfectly folded omelet onto a plate. "A break, I guess. From being that person." "Which person?" "The one who's always 3 steps ahead, as you put it." He started on the second omelet, not meeting her eyes. "Sometimes it's exhausting, being exactly who everyone expects you to be." The honesty in his voice touched something in Sarah. She understood all too well what it meant to step away from expectations, to choose a different path. When they finally sat down to eat, the silence felt natural rather than awkward. Sarah couldn't remember the last time she'd felt this comfortable with someone she'd just met. It was dangerous, this easy connection with a man who would be gone again in a couple of weeks. "You weren't kidding about the omelet," she said, taking another bite. "This is really good." "Told you." His smile reached his eyes this time, crinkling the corners in a way that made Sarah's heart skip. "Though I'm not sure if it's actually good or if we're just hungry enough that anything would taste amazing." "Probably a bit of both." Sarah smiled back, trying to ignore how the soft kitchen lights softened his features, made him look more approachable. Less like a successful lawyer and more like someone who could belong here. "Manual labor will do that to you." "Is that your professional opinion, Dr. Walker?" "Absolutely. I prescribe regular farm work for all my patients suffering from urban sophistication." He laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "I'll have to keep that in mind." Sarah took another bite of her dinner, painfully aware that she was enjoying this far too much. James Winter was temporary, here for the holidays, nothing more. She'd be wise to remember that. But sitting across from him in the warm kitchen, watching him slowly relax into himself, Sarah wondered if wisdom was perhaps a little overrated. Sarah stared at her empty plate, knowing she should leave but finding it surprisingly difficult to move. The kitchen clock ticked steadily, marking time in a way that felt both too fast and too slow. I should probably head out, she said finally, rising to take her plate to the sink. Early rounds tomorrow, and I'll need to check on Betsy first thing. James stood too, gathering their coffee mugs. What time will you be back? Around 7, if that works. Unless you'd rather sleep in, I can use the spare key Ethan keeps in the. 7's fine, he said quickly. I'll have coffee ready. Sarah nodded, trying not to read too much into the offer. It was just coffee, just neighbors helping each other out. The fact that her pulse quickened at the thought of seeing him again in the morning was irrelevant. They worked in companionable silence, cleaning up the kitchen. Every so often, their hands would brush as they passed dishes back and forth, each touch sending little sparks of awareness through her. Sarah focused on drying a plate, pretending she didn't notice how James seemed to find reasons to reach around her for various items, his presence warm at her back. You don't have to do this, he said as she wiped down the counter. You've already helped more than enough today. Force of habit. Sarah smiled, remembering countless evenings spent in this kitchen with Olivia. Besides, my grandmother always said never leave a kitchen messier than you found it. Sounds like a wise woman. She was. Sarah hung the dishcloth over the sink's edge. She would have loved this place, the farm, the island, the way everyone looks out for each other. Something shifted in James's expression. Is that why you stayed? Because people look out for each other? Partly. Sarah gathered her coat from where she'd draped it over a kitchen chair. But mostly because it felt like home from the first day. Like I'd been looking for this place without knowing it. James stepped closer, helping her with her coat. His fingers brushed the back of her neck as he lifted her hair free of the collar, and Sarah had to suppress a shiver. I think I understand that, he said softly. They walked to the front door together, their steps slow as if by mutual agreement. On the porch, the lamp cast everything in a gentle glow, softening edges and creating shadows. A cold breeze carried the salt scent of the ocean, and Sarah pulled her coat tighter. Thank you for dinner, she said, turning to face him. And for helping with the animals. Pretty sure I'm the one who should be thanking you. James stood close enough that she had to tip her head back slightly to meet his eyes. For staying, for explaining things, for. He trailed off, his gaze dropping to her lips for just a moment before returning to her eyes. Sarah's heart thundered in her chest. It would be so easy to lean forward, to close that small distance between them. To find out if his lips were as warm as they looked, if they'd taste like the coffee they'd shared. Instead, she took a step back. I'll see you in the morning. Drive safe, he said, his voice rough. Sarah felt his eyes on her all the way to her truck. The urge to look back was almost overwhelming, but she forced herself to keep walking. This attraction, this connection, it couldn't go anywhere. The last thing she needed right now was to complicate her carefully built peace with feelings for someone who wasn't staying. The drive home passed in a blur of confused emotions. Her small brick house welcomed her with familiar shadows and silent rooms. Magnus wound around her ankles the moment she stepped inside, his loud purrs a greeting and gentle scolding all at once. I know. I'm late. Sarah scooped up the large orange tabby, burying her face in his soft fur. Let's get you dinner. She went through her usual evening routine, feeding Magnus, changing into comfortable clothes, making tea. Everything was exactly as it always was. But tonight, the quiet that usually felt peaceful now seemed empty. The solitude she'd chosen and cultivated felt less like freedom and more like absence. Sarah curled up in her favorite reading chair, Magnus settling into her lap with a contented purr. Outside her window, the moon hung low in the winter sky, its light catching on frost-covered branches of the old oak tree in her front yard. On nights like this, she usually felt grateful for her choice to come here, for the simple life she'd built. Tonight, though, her thoughts kept drifting back to the farmhouse. To the way James's laugh had filled the kitchen with warmth, how natural it had felt to work beside him, the way his eyes had softened when he talked about coming home. She couldn't remember the last time conversation had flowed so easily with someone, or when silence had felt so comfortable. Magnus headbutted her hand, demanding attention. Sarah smiled, scratching behind his ears. Just you and me, buddy. That's how we like it, remember? But the words rang hollow. She thought of James alone in that big farmhouse, waiting for news about his brother's baby. Thought of how his practiced smile had gradually given way to genuine warmth over the course of the evening. How for a moment, standing on that porch, she'd wanted to. No, she said firmly, startling Magnus. We're not going there. The cat gave her a look that seemed distinctly skeptical, before settling back into her lap. Sarah sipped her tea, trying to focus on the book she'd been meaning to read all week. But the words blurred together, and her mind kept wandering. To strong hands competently handling animals. To brown eyes crinkling at the corners when he smiled. To the way he'd said "Seven's fine," like he was looking forward to seeing her again. This is ridiculous, she muttered. I barely know him. Yet something about James Winter felt familiar, like recognition rather than discovery. As if some part of her had been waiting to meet him without realizing it. Sarah set her book aside with a sigh. She was letting loneliness and attraction cloud her judgment. James wasn't looking for anything here except a temporary escape from his real life. In a few weeks, he'd return to Birmingham, to his successful law practice and sophisticated city existence. And she'd still be here, caring for the island's animals, building the life she'd chosen. Better to remember that now, before this attraction could grow into something more complicated. Before the warmth in his brown eyes and the gentle way he'd helped her with her coat could become memories that ached. Magnus stretched in her lap, completely unconcerned with his human's emotional turmoil. Sarah envied his simplicity, his contentment with things exactly as they were. Early morning tomorrow, she told him. We should both get some rest. Chapter 3. James checked his watch again. Almost 7. He'd been up since 5, unable to sleep in the quiet farmhouse. After tossing and turning for an hour, he'd given up and headed downstairs to start on farm chores. The familiar morning routines of his childhood had settled his restless mind. All the animals were watered and fed. A basket of fresh eggs sat on the counter, reminding him of dinner with the beautiful vet he couldn't get out of his mind. The coffee maker gurgled, filling the kitchen with rich aroma. He'd set out 2 mugs, cream and sugar, then rearranged them twice, feeling foolish about fussing over such a simple thing. But mornings in Birmingham meant grabbing coffee from his favorite shop on the way to the office, not sharing it with someone in his family's warm kitchen. His phone buzzed, a text from Ethan. No changes overnight, but the medication seemed to be working. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. James had just finished responding when he saw a familiar vehicle approach. Sarah's truck pulled up right at 7, and James found himself moving to the door before she could knock. He opened it to find her juggling a basket and what looked like a bag from Sweet Treats Bakery. Need a hand? He asked, reaching for the basket. Thanks. Sarah's cheeks were pink from the cold, her hair tucked under a knit cap. The basket's treats for the animals, carrots, apples, that sort of thing. And I thought you might like something more substantial than just coffee for breakfast. You didn't have to do that. But James was already peeking in the Sweet Treats bag, the scent of fresh baked goods making his stomach growl. Consider it a thank you for last night's dinner. She unwound her scarf, and James caught a hint of vanilla and something floral, her shampoo maybe. Besides, Mrs. Caldwell at the bakery always saves the first batch of blueberry muffins for me. They're still warm. They smell amazing. James's stomach growled. They taste even better, Sarah promised. How's Betsy? No change this morning, but I'm not the expert, he said. They moved into the kitchen together, an ease in their movements that surprised James. Sarah went straight for the coffee while he set out plates and napkins. I'll check on her. Any word from Ethan? She asked, adding cream to her coffee. James nodded, breaking a muffin in half. Steam rose from its center. The medications are helping. They're hoping to keep the baby in for at least another few days. That's good news. Sarah's smile was warm and genuine. Every day makes a difference at this stage. They ate quickly, speaking only to share updates about Olivia and the occasional appreciative murmur over Mrs. Caldwell's baking skills. James found himself studying Sarah when she wasn't looking, the graceful way she held her coffee mug, how her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled, the quiet confidence in her movements. "Ready to start rounds?" she asked, gathering their empty plates and sticking them in the dishwasher Ethan had installed sometime last year. "Lead the way, Dr. Walker." Sarah turned, one eyebrow raised. "Dr. Walker? What happened to Sarah? Are we back to formalities after sharing those delicious muffins?" "Force of habit," James said, feeling his ears warm. 15 years of addressing everyone by their titles. "Though I suppose if we're going to spend the morning mucking stalls together, we should stick to first names." "Probably wise." Her eyes sparkled with amusement. "Unless you'd prefer I call you Mr. Winter?" "I don't. Around here, that's my father." "James it is, then." Sarah's smile was warm enough to chase away the December chill. "Now come on. We have animals waiting." Outside, their breath fogged in the cold morning air. "Let me check on Betsy first," Sarah said, already turning toward the barn. "She's my priority patient this morning." James followed her into the warm space, watching how confidently she moved around the pregnant cow. Her hands were gentle but sure as she examined Betsy, murmuring soft words of encouragement. "Well?" he asked when she straightened. "She's in early labor." Sarah's expression was focused, professional. "I'd say we'll have a calf within the next few hours. We should probably do our rounds quickly. I want to keep a close eye on her." "Anything I can do to help?" "For now, just stick close. I might need an extra pair of hands later." She patted Betsy one last time before retrieving her basket. "But first, let's take care of everyone else. Starting with this lady's Christmas treats." Sarah distributed produce from her basket as they moved from animal to animal, a carrot for the ancient pony that had been around since James was a kid, apple slices for the goats, alfalfa cubes for the cows. "They obviously love you," James said, watching how even the usually standoffish animals crowded around her. "Food is the universal language." But she patted each animal with genuine affection, knowing their quirks and preferences. "Though I think they're just happy someone remembers their Christmas treats." They fell into an efficient rhythm, working together as if they'd done this for years instead of just meeting yesterday. James found himself relaxing into the familiar motions of farm life, his body remembering what his mind had forgotten. Sarah seemed to know exactly when to offer guidance and when to step back, her presence both supportive and unobtrusive. Until they got to the milking parlor. "I swear this machine worked differently when I was younger," James muttered, staring at the apparatus with growing frustration. The sophisticated printing equipment in his Birmingham office felt simpler than this suddenly complex piece of farm machinery. Sarah appeared at his elbow, amusement dancing in her eyes. "Need some help?" "I was thinking about doing it by hand," he admitted. "Might be easier. For one cow, maybe. But let's figure this out together." She stepped closer, reaching around him to adjust something on the machine. "See this valve here? It's been upgraded since your day. Now you have to." James tried to focus on her explanation, but found himself distracted by her proximity, the way her shoulder pressed against his arm as she demonstrated the proper technique. Her hands were capable and sure on the equipment, and he found that oddly compelling. "Want to try?" she asked, stepping back slightly. James nodded, hyper-aware of her watching as he mimicked her movements. The machine hummed to life properly this time, and he felt ridiculously pleased with himself. "Fast learner," Sarah said approvingly. "Though I suppose that's not surprising for a successful lawyer." "This is a little different from corporate law," James said with a laugh. "Less paperwork, for one thing. No billable hours either." Sarah checked some gauges on the machine. "Though I imagine the early mornings are an adjustment." "Everything's an adjustment," James admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. "But not necessarily in a bad way. I don't know. Simpler here." More immediate. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. That's what drew me to large animal practice. There's something real about it. Tangible. She paused, checking on the cow. Speaking of tangible, I think Betsy's getting close. See how she's positioning herself? James moved to where she indicated, noting the cow's restless movements. How soon? Hard to say exactly, but it won't be long. We should. Sarah broke off as Betsy let out a low sound. Definitely getting closer. Mind helping me set up? They worked together preparing the barn, James following Sarah's quiet instructions. She explained each step as they went, her teaching style natural and encouraging. He found himself asking questions, genuinely interested in understanding the process rather than just following directions. You're good at this, he said as they finished laying fresh straw. Teaching, I mean. Making things clear without making someone feel foolish for not knowing. Sarah looked surprised by the compliment. Thanks. I guess it comes from working with farmers. They know their animals better than anyone. They just sometimes need help understanding the medical side of things. Still, it's a gift. James watched her check Betsy again, amazed by how the cow clearly trusted her. Being able to connect with both animals and people that way. Says the man who can apparently charm juries and cook a perfect omelet, Sarah teased, but her cheeks had flushed pink. James laughed, the sound echoing in the barn. When was the last time he'd laughed this freely? In Birmingham, everything was measured, calculated. Here, with Sarah, he felt more like himself than he had in years. I should probably check in with the office, he said reluctantly, checking his watch. Make sure there's nothing urgent that needs my attention. And I want to call Ethan, see if there are any updates about Olivia. Sarah nodded, focused on Betsy. Go ahead. We've got things under control here. Though you might want to grab another coffee first. I have a feeling it's going to be a long day. James headed toward the house, pausing at the barn door to look back. Sarah was talking softly to Betsy, her presence calm and reassuring. The morning sun slanted through the barn windows, catching in her hair and creating a moment so perfectly peaceful that it made his chest ache. He shook his head, trying to clear it of thoughts that had no business taking root. This wasn't why he'd come home. Pulling out his phone, he walked into the house and dialed his office. Morning, Carol. James. Enjoying your time off? Her familiar voice was warm. Though I have to admit, I'm a little surprised to hear from you. I thought you were taking a real break this time. I am. Just checking to make sure everything's under control. Of course it is. That's why you pay me the big bucks. There was a smile in her voice. Enjoy your holiday, James. You've earned it. His call to Ethan went straight to voicemail. Hey, just checking in. Everything's fine here on the farm. Sarah's with Betsy. Looks like we might have a calf by afternoon. Call when you can with any updates about Olivia. James glanced at his watch, nearly lunchtime. He put together a couple of sandwiches and fixed fresh coffee, figuring Sarah wouldn't want to leave Betsy for long. The simple task felt natural, domestic in a way that surprised him. When was the last time he'd made lunch for someone that wasn't a business meeting? Balancing the food and drinks, he headed back to the barn, drawn to the warmth and purpose he'd found there. James watched Sarah roll her shoulders, trying to work out the tension from hours of monitoring Betsy. They'd been in the barn since dawn, and while the cow was progressing normally, Sarah had explained that deliveries could take a while. Why don't we take a break, he suggested, noticing how she kept stretching her neck. Betsy's resting between contractions. We could eat those sandwiches I made, get some fresh air. Sarah hesitated, glancing at the bovine. We'll be right outside, he assured her. Close enough to hear if anything changes. You're right. Sarah checked Betsy one more time before straightening. A few minutes of fresh air would do us both good. The winter sun had climbed high enough to take the edge off the December chill. James grabbed a couple of old quilts from the stack his mother kept by the barn door and arranged them over hay bales positioned just outside. From here, they could still hear any sounds from the barn while enjoying the midday warmth. Here. He handed Sarah one of the sandwiches he'd made earlier. Nothing fancy, but it'll keep us going. Thanks. She settled onto one of the hay bales, positioning herself so she could see into the barn. Every few bites, she'd pause, listening intently to any sound from Betsy. They ate in comfortable silence, looking out over the farm. From here, they could see most of the property, the rolling pastures stretching toward the tree line, the chicken coop where new eggs waited to be gathered, even the ancient oak tree where his father had built their treehouse still standing guard over the farm pond. "What made you become a vet?" James asked, watching her take in the view with obvious appreciation. "Was it always the plan?" Sarah smiled, something distant in her expression. "Actually, I started pre-med. My parents had my whole life mapped out: prestigious medical school, surgical residency, joining my father's practice." She paused, turning at a sound from the barn, but Betsy had just shifted positions. "Then during my sophomore year, I started volunteering at an animal shelter." "And everything changed?" "Not right away. But there was this one dog, a big German Shepherd mix. He'd been abused, wouldn't let anyone near him." Her eyes softened at the memory, though she kept glancing toward the barn door. "Spent 3 months just sitting outside his kennel, reading my textbooks out loud. The day he finally came up and put his head in my lap. That's when I knew." James could picture it clearly, a younger Sarah, determined and patient, winning over a frightened animal through sheer persistence. "Your parents must have been thrilled." Sarah laughed, the sound carrying across the yard. "Oh yeah. Especially when I switched to large animal practice." She stood suddenly at a low moan from Betsy, then settled back when nothing followed. Can you imagine their faces? Their daughter, who they'd pictured in designer suits doing delicate surgeries, covered in mud and delivering calves at midnight. "I might have some idea," James said, thinking of his own father's expression when he'd announced he was leaving the farm for law school. "Though in my case, it was the opposite direction. I traded mud for suits." "Do you miss it?" Sarah asked softly. "The farm life?" James considered the question, watching a flock of geese arc across the winter sky. "Sometimes. More than I realized, maybe. Everything in Birmingham is so calculated. Precise. Exactly what I wanted when I left. Here, it's messy, but more real somehow." "That's why I love it," Sarah said. "Especially on the island. There's no pretense here. Animals don't care what you're wearing or which family you come from. They just know if they can trust you." She brushed hay from her jeans, her movements efficient even in rest. "Like Betsy in there. She doesn't care about my credentials. She just knows I'm here to help." "Is that what brought you to Palmar Island? The lack of pretense?" "Partly." Sarah shifted on the hay bale, her attention divided between their conversation and the barn. "I was working at a high-end practice in Atlanta. Designer pets, owners more worried about cosmetic procedures than actual health. One day, I saw a job listing for an island veterinarian. Posted it on my office wall as a joke, my escape plan. But it wasn't really a joke?" "No." Sarah's smile was soft, remembering. "I came down to check it out, thinking I'd hate it. But the minute I stepped foot on the island." She trailed off as another sound came from the barn. This time when she stood, James could tell it was different. "We need to get back in there. Betsy's ready." James followed her into the barn, their earlier conversation still echoing in his mind. He understood that feeling she'd described, of a place claiming you without warning. He'd felt it too, all those years ago, but in reverse. Birmingham had called to him with its promise of importance, of making a difference in courtrooms instead of barnyards. Now, watching Sarah prepare for the birth with such quiet competence, he wondered if he hadn't been running from something instead of toward it. "James?" Sarah's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Could you grab those towels?" He moved to help, their eyes meeting briefly over Betsy's back. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding of sorts, a spark of recognition that scared the wits out of him. Then Betsy let out a low moan, and they focused on the task at hand. The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Sarah's calm instructions guided him, her presence steady and reassuring. When the calf finally appeared, wet and wondering, James felt his breath catch. He'd seen animals born before, it was part of farm life, but this felt different. Special. He's perfect, Sarah said softly, helping the wobbly calf find his feet. Her face glowed with joy and professional satisfaction, and James found himself watching her as much as the newborn. A healthy bull calf. Betsy turned to nuzzle her baby, and James felt something shift inside his chest. The simple miracle of new life, the quiet pride in Sarah's eyes, the familiar smells and sounds of the barn, it all felt right in a way his corner office never had. James watched Sarah's taillights disappear down the drive, before pulling out his phone. This time, Ethan answered on the second ring. "Hey. Everything okay at the farm?" His brother sounded tired, but less tense than earlier. "Better than okay. Betsy just had her calf. It's a healthy bull, already on his feet." "That's great." Ethan's relief was evident even through the phone. "All things considered, I'm glad you came home early, but I'm worried about leaving you with everything. It's a lot if you're not used to it anymore." "I'm managing fine." James smiled, remembering Sarah's patient guidance with the milking machine. Besides, Sarah's been helping. She offered to stop by whenever needed. Did she now? The teasing note in Ethan's voice was unmistakable. "Funny how often the island's vet needs to check on our perfectly healthy animals." "Don't start." James ran a hand through his hair, grateful his brother couldn't see his face. "How are Olivia and the baby doing?" "Taking it one day at a time." "1 hour, really?" Ethan's voice softened. "The medication seemed to be working, though." Doctor's cautiously optimistic. "Need anything?" "I don't mind coming to the hospital. Just stay there and take care of the farm." "And James?" Ethan paused. "Thanks. For coming home." "That's what big brothers are for," James said quietly, realizing he meant it more than he had in years. "Get some rest. I'll call later." Chapter 4. Sarah hadn't planned on stopping by the winter farm. Her last appointment had been halfway across the island, and she had paperwork waiting at the clinic. But as she'd driven past the familiar turn-off, memories of shared coffee and easy conversation had tugged at her. Just a quick check on the new calf, she told herself. Professional responsibility and all that. She knew she was lying to herself. 2 days of morning visits had created the beginning of a routine she wasn't ready to break, even if there was no medical reason for it. James had proven surprisingly capable around the farm, despite his years away. He didn't need her hovering around, offering help he hadn't asked for. Yet here she was, turning onto the gravel drive as the winter sun hung low in the afternoon sky. She found both winter brothers in the barn, Ethan leaning against a stall, while James updated him on the farm's status. Even exhausted, their resemblance was striking. Same tall build, same way of standing with hands in their pockets. But where Ethan's worry showed plainly on his face, James carried his concern differently, a slight tension in his shoulders, a watchfulness in his eyes. "Dr. Walker," Ethan straightened when he saw her. "Everything okay?" "Sarah," she corrected automatically. "Just thought I'd check on our newest resident." She nodded toward Betsy's stall, trying not to notice how James's face had brightened at her arrival. "How's Olivia?" "Holding steady." Ethan's relief was evident, though dark circles under his eyes spoke of sleepless nights. "The medications are working for now. Doctor thinks if we can keep the baby in for another week, maybe 2. He trailed off, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "That's good news." Sarah moved to check on the calf, who was already steady on his feet and nursing well. "Have you gotten any sleep?" "Not much. Thought I'd grab a shower and a few hours rest before heading back." Ethan managed a tired smile. "James has things under control here, though." Even figured out the milking machine. Eventually, James said, catching Sarah's eye with a hint of shared humor. Though I had help. I wasn't going to ask about those dents in the side panel, Ethan said dryly. Those were there before, James protested, though his ears had reddened slightly. Sarah bit back a smile, remembering their shared struggle with the equipment. The calf looks great, she said, changing the subject. You've done a good job, James. Had a good teacher. The warmth in his voice made her pulse skip. I'll leave you to it then. Ethan pushed off from the stall. Try to keep the house quiet for a few hours? James nodded. Get some rest. I was thinking of heading into town anyway. You should check out the Christmas market, Sarah heard herself say. It's quite something on opening day. Both brothers turned to look at her, and Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. But she was committed now. The whole town turns out. Local vendors, holiday music, the works. My friend Joel is performing, he has an amazing voice, especially with Christmas carols. Better than sitting around an empty house, James said, his eyes not leaving her face. I heard they even have a real reindeer this year, Sarah added, trying to sound casual. I've been meaning to check on it, make sure everything's set up properly. A professional concern then, James said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. Purely professional. Sarah busied herself with her medical bag, avoiding both brothers' knowing looks. Though the market itself is worth seeing. The whole square looks magical with all the lights and decorations. You should definitely go, Ethan said, and Sarah caught the look he shot his older brother. Especially if you have someone to show you around. I wouldn't mind the company, Sarah said, her heart beating faster. If you're interested. I'd like that. James's smile reached his eyes, warming them in a way that made Sarah forget the December chill. Great. She checked her watch, grateful for something to look at besides James's face. Joel's performance starts in about an hour. Gives you time to get cleaned up. She gestured vaguely at the hay dust coating his clothes. And me time to sleep, Ethan said, already heading toward the house. Don't worry about the evening chores, James. I'll handle them when I get up. You sure? James asked. Positive. Go, enjoy the market. Ethan paused at the barn door. And James? Thanks. For being here when we needed you. Something passed between the brothers then, years of history and understanding condensed into a look. Then Ethan was gone, leaving Sarah and James in a silence that felt charged with possibility. I should go change, James said finally. Where should I meet you? Meet me by the big Christmas tree in the town square? Sarah suggested. Around 6? James nodded. I'll be there. Sarah drove home in a daze, barely remembering the familiar roads. What had she been thinking, inviting him to the market? This wasn't part of her carefully constructed island life, these butterflies in her stomach, this urge to change her outfit 3 times before settling on a soft emerald sweater and her favorite jeans. Yet an hour later, she found herself scanning the crowd by the town Christmas tree, her heart jumping when she spotted James walking toward her. He'd changed into dark jeans and a charcoal gray sweater that made him look like he belonged here. Right on time, she said, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. Some habits are hard to break. But his smile was relaxed, genuine. Where do we start? The market sprawled across the town square, white tents glowing with strings of lights. The scent of cinnamon and pine filled the air, mixing with wood smoke from the fire pits scattered throughout. Joel's clear voice carried over the crowd, his rendition of Silent Night adding to the festive atmosphere. Let's make a loop, Sarah suggested. Get the lay of the land before checking on Santa and his reindeer. They strolled past booths selling everything from hand-knit scarves to wooden toys. Sarah found herself watching James as much as the vendors, enjoying his genuine interest in the local crafts. She introduced him to people she'd come to know over her 3 years here, Mr. Smith with his intricate glass-blown ornaments, old Mr. Murphy and his carved decoy ducks, Katie Williams selling jewelry made from sea glass she collected on the beach. To her surprise and pleasure, most remembered James from his childhood on the island. Their warm welcomes transformed him further, bringing out a side of him she hadn't seen before, less reserved, more connected to this place she'd come to love. "James Winter, is that you?" Miss Doris's voice carried across the crowd. She stood behind a table laden with baked goods, her silver curls caught in the Christmas lights. "I thought you weren't coming until next week." "Change of plans." James led Sarah toward the booth, where the scent of vanilla and butter made her mouth water. "Though I see some things never change. Your famous sugar cookies still look perfect." Flatterer. But Miss Doris beamed, already filling a box with an assortment of treats. "Sarah, dear, make sure he tries the gingerbread. It's his mother's recipe, you know. She used to help with the bake sale every year before the cruise." "I didn't know you baked," Sarah said to James. "I don't. But I was an excellent taste tester." He picked up a coconut macaroon, biting into it with obvious pleasure. "Still am, apparently. Here." Miss Doris pressed the box into his hands. "On the house. Consider it a welcome home gift." Her eyes twinkled as she glanced between them. "Though I suspect the island has more welcome home gifts in store for you than just cookies." Sarah felt her cheeks warm, but before she could respond, Joel Fisher launched into White Christmas, and the crowd's attention shifted toward the performance area. "We should find a good spot to watch," she said quickly. "Joel's second set is always his best. He's been performing here since before he made it big." They found a place near one of the fire pits, close enough to feel its warmth, but far enough from the crowd to talk. James opened the box of treats, offering her first choice. "Miss Doris still seems to know everything that happens on the island," he said, selecting a piece of gingerbread. "She does." Sarah chose a sugar cookie, decorated with perfect silvery icing. "But she also knows when to keep secrets." "So I hear." "Want to check on that reindeer now?" James asked, brushing cookie crumbs from his sweater. "Since that was your professional excuse for coming here." Sarah nudged his shoulder playfully. "I really did want to make sure the animal was properly cared for. But yes, let's head that way." They found the reindeer in a spacious temporary enclosure near the edge of the market. Sarah was immediately impressed by the setup: fresh hay, proper shelter, clean water, and enough space for the animal to move comfortably. The reindeer himself looked healthy and calm, watching the crowd with mild interest while munching on special feed. "Looking for something specific, Dr. Walker?" a deep voice asked from behind them. Sarah turned to find Scott Callahan approaching, his Santa suit jacket draped over one arm, revealing a warm flannel shirt underneath. Even without the iconic red coat, there was something inherently Santa-like about him: the thick beard, the kind eyes, the way his whole face participated in his smile. "Scott Callahan?" James stepped forward, recognition lighting his face. "Last time I saw you, you were stealing bases on the Palmar Island baseball team. And you were the best pitcher we had." Scott's grin was warm and genuine, his blue eyes twinkling. Even without the fake white beard he'd obviously be wearing later, there was something inherently Santa-like about him. "Heard you traded your fastball for a law degree. And you turned that talent with wood into quite the business." James nodded toward the custom furniture displays visible in a nearby tent. "The pieces in your workshop window always catch my eye when I drive past." "Just being nosy," Sarah cut in, nodding toward the reindeer. "But I'm impressed, Scott. This is a perfect setup for Cupid." "Had to be." Scott reached over the fence to scratch behind the reindeer's ears, his broad shoulders relaxed despite the busy market around them. "He's pretty particular about his accommodations, aren't you, boy? Spends his summers up north where it's cooler." "Can't blame him, these South Carolina summers would be rough with that thick coat." "He looks exceptionally well cared for," Sarah said, noting the animal's bright eyes and glossy coat. "He better be. Cost me enough in specialized vet care to learn exactly what he needs." Scott's eyes crinkled with good humor. "Though I suppose that's nothing compared to what I spend on presents." "Presents?" James asked. "For the kids who need them most." Scott's voice softened. The workshop does well enough that I can take some time off during the holidays. Been playing Santa at the market since that last summer we played ball together. Remember how we used to pass the hat around after games for Tommy Smith's medical bills? He smiled at the memory. Figured I could do more than just pass a hat these days. Sarah watched James's expression shift from polite interest to genuine respect. That's quite a commitment. Started small, Scott said, pulling his Santa coat back on. 10 kids my first year. Now, with help from folks around here, we manage about 100. Miss Doris's bake sale actually helps fund some of it. As do the pictures. And with Cupid the last couple of years, interest has exploded. I'm not surprised, Sarah said fondly. Is there any good cause on this island she's not involved in? Not that I've found. Scott straightened his collar. Speaking of causes, I should get back to work. Got a line of kids waiting to tell Santa their wishes. He winked at them. Though sometimes the best wishes come true without ever being spoken. They watched him stride away, immediately surrounded by excited children. He hasn't changed a bit, James said quietly. Still looking out for everyone else. The island's full of people like that. Sarah turned to look at him, finding his eyes already on her. People here, they have layers. Depth. Like Miss Doris with her baking empire funding good causes, or Scott using his success to play Santa. Or veterinarians who make house calls just to check on lonely lawyers. There was something soft in James's expression that made Sarah's heart flutter. Professional responsibility, she reminded him, but couldn't help smiling. Of course. His hand found hers, warm, despite the December chill. Thank you for bringing me here tonight. For helping me see the island through new eyes. Sarah squeezed his fingers, not trusting herself to speak. Around them, the market glowed with Christmas lights. Joel's voice lifted in "I believe in Father Christmas," and Scott's deep "ho, ho, ho" carried across the square. But in that moment, all Sarah could focus on was the way James's thumb traced circles on her palm, and how right it felt to be standing here with him, rediscovering the magic of her adopted home together. The sound of children's laughter followed them as they wandered away from Santa's station, their hands still linked. Sarah found herself hyper-aware of James's presence beside her, the warmth of his palm against hers, how natural it felt to walk together through the festive market. Oh, wait. She tugged him toward a booth draped in twinkling lights. You have to see these. Mrs. Tanner's ornament display caught the light, each handcrafted piece telling its own story. Glass balls filled with sand and tiny shells, wooden stars carved with island scenes, delicate angels made from sea glass and driftwood. I get one every year, Sarah admitted, running her finger over a glass ball with a miniature farm scene inside. Sort of my own island tradition. They're beautiful. James picked up a wooden ornament shaped like a barn, complete with tiny animals carved into its surface. This reminds me of home. That's the idea. Mrs. Tanner spoke up from behind her display. Each one's meant to capture a memory, a moment worth keeping. Sarah watched James study the ornament, noting how his expression softened as he traced the careful details. This Christmas deserves commemorating, don't you think? He looked at her then, something warm and wondering in his eyes. Yeah, he said softly. I suppose it does. As James paid for the ornament, Sarah pretended not to notice how carefully he handled it, how he tucked it safely in his coat pocket like something precious. But her heart skipped when he reached for her hand again, and she couldn't help hoping this might be the first of many island traditions they'd share. They wandered through the market, neither wanting the evening to end. Joel had switched to slower carols, his voice carrying Silent Night across the square. The scent of pine boughs and cinnamon hung in the air, mixing with wood smoke from the fire pits. Just one more booth, Sarah said, though they'd said that 3 booths ago. She led him toward a display of wreaths, only to hear a soft chuckle from the vendor. Look up, you two. Sarah tilted her head back to find mistletoe hanging from the booth's frame, its white berries gleaming in the Christmas lights. Heat crept into her cheeks as she turned to James, finding him already looking at her with an expression that made her breath catch. It is tradition, he murmured, stepping closer. His free hand came up to cup her cheek, thumb brushing softly across her skin. Sarah caught the lingering sweetness of Miss Doris's cookies on his breath, mingled with coffee and winter air. When his lips touched hers, the market sounds faded away. The carol, the crowd, even the crackling fires all dissolved into background noise. There was only the warmth of his mouth, gentle at first, then deeper as she curled her fingers into his sweater. He tasted like gingerbread and possibility, like coming home to a place she never knew she was missing. The kiss lasted forever and not nearly long enough. When they finally pulled apart, Sarah kept her eyes closed for a moment, savoring the lingering sensation. James's hand had slipped to the back of her neck, and she could feel the rapid beat of his heart where she was pressed against his chest. "Best tradition yet," he said softly, and she could hear the smile in his voice. Chapter 5. James heard Sarah's truck before he saw it, the familiar sound making him smile despite the early hour. They'd fallen into an easy routine these past days: coffee and farm chores, comfortable conversation, shared work that felt more like pleasure than obligation. But after last night's kiss at the market, everything felt different. More significant somehow. He met her at the barn door, 2 steaming travel mugs in hand. "Wasn't sure if you'd been by the coffee shop yet." "My hero." Sarah's smile was warm as she took one of the mugs. If she felt any awkwardness about last night, it didn't show. "How's everyone this morning?" "Fed and watered." He followed her into the barn, watching her make her usual rounds. "Though I think that young goat is plotting an escape. Caught her studying the fence line earlier." "That would be Houdini." "She lives up to her name." Sarah checked on the animal in question, who looked entirely too innocent. "Speaking of escapes, you never did tell me what brought you home early for Christmas." James leaned against a stall door, considering how to answer. The morning light streamed through the barn windows, catching dust motes in its beam. Somewhere outside, a rooster crowed belatedly. "Would you believe I'm running away from Birmingham?" he said finally. Sarah settled onto a hay bale, cradling her coffee. "Running from something or towards something?" "Both." "Neither." He ran a hand through his hair. "Claire and I broke up about 6 months ago." "Claire?" "My girlfriend." "Ex-girlfriend." The word still felt strange. "We'd been together since law school. Everyone assumed we'd get married eventually, including us. But when we finally sat down to talk about it..." He trailed off, remembering that painful conversation. "What happened?" Sarah's voice was gentle, free of judgment. "We realized we didn't want the same things anymore." "Hadn't for a while, probably." James sat beside her, the hay bale moving slightly. "She's taking a position with an international firm in London. I was supposed to make partner next year. On paper, we had everything figured out, but something was missing." "The heart of it?" Sarah suggested quietly. "Yes." He stared into his coffee. "We'd grown in different directions without noticing. When we finally did, it was like looking at a stranger wearing the face of someone I used to love." Sarah didn't speak, just waited for him to continue. Her silence felt supportive rather than expectant. "The funny thing is, once we admitted it, it was almost a relief. Like we'd both been playing parts in a play neither of us wanted to be in anymore." He glanced at her. "Does that make any sense?" "More than you might think." Sarah's hand found his, warm and reassuring. "Sometimes the hardest part isn't the ending. It's admitting something needs to end." James squeezed her fingers, grateful for her understanding. After that, everything in Birmingham felt hollow. The job, the lifestyle, all of it. I kept wondering if I was living someone else's life instead of my own. "So you came home." "So I came home." He smiled slightly. "Though I didn't expect to find." He gestured vaguely at the barn, at her, at everything. "A bunch of farm chores and a bossy veterinarian?" Her eyes sparkled with humor. "Peace," he said softly. "I found peace here. And maybe something else I wasn't looking for." Sarah's smile softened at his words. It's funny, isn't it? How we end up exactly where we need to be, even if it's not where we planned. Like a certain someone I know from Atlanta finding home on a small island? James watched her expression shift, knowing he'd hit on something. My parents still haven't forgiven me. Sarah traced the rim of her coffee mug. They had such big plans, their daughter, the prestigious small animal surgeon. Instead, I'm out here in rubber boots, delivering fowls at midnight. But you're happy. I am. Happier than I've been in years. She met his eyes. Still, sometimes I wonder if I'm letting them down. If I'm letting myself down, walking away from what everyone expected me to be. James nodded, understanding completely. I keep thinking about my father's face when I told him I was going to law school. He never said anything, but you felt like you were abandoning the farm? Yeah. The word came out rough. Even though Ethan was already committed to staying, even though the farm was in good hands. I felt like I was choosing something else over family. And now? Sarah's question was gentle. Now I'm wondering if I wasn't running away from something I was afraid I couldn't live up to. He stared out the barn door at the familiar fields. The funny thing is, being back here, working the farm. It feels right in a way Birmingham never did. That doesn't mean those years away were wrong, Sarah said. Maybe you needed that time to figure out who you are, what you really want. Like you needed Atlanta to lead you here? Exactly. She squeezed his hand. Sometimes the long way around is the only way to get where you're meant to be. James turned to look at her, struck by how the morning light softened her features. I've been thinking about staying, he said quietly. Not just for the holidays. Sarah's breath caught. What about your practice? Your life in Birmingham? I could open a small practice here. The island could use a good lawyer. The idea took shape as he spoke it, feeling more right with each word. Help local businesses, maybe do some family law. Make a difference in a different way. But? Sarah prompted, hearing his hesitation. But it's terrifying, he admitted. Starting over at my age. Leaving everything I've built. Wondering if I'm making another mistake. I get that. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. When I first came here, I was so scared. Scared I was throwing away my career, scared I'd fail, scared I'd end up alone on an island where I didn't know anyone. What changed? I realized being scared was better than being numb. She looked up at him. And I wasn't as alone as I thought. The island has a way of giving you what you need, even if it's not what you were looking for. James felt something shift in his chest, a certainty settling into place. Like a beautiful vet who makes house calls? Sarah's cheeks flushed pink, but she held his gaze. Like a lawyer who remembers how to milk cows. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the morning sounds of the farm washing over them. James marveled at how easy it was to share these fears with her, how her presence made the idea of starting over feel less daunting. For what it's worth, Sarah said finally, I think you'd be a great island lawyer. God knows we could use someone who understands both legal and farming contracts. James laughed, the sound echoing in the barn. Is that your professional opinion, Dr. Walker? Absolutely. Her smile was bright enough to chase away any lingering doubts. And I never give bad medical advice. A loud bleat from one of the goats broke their moment of quiet understanding. Sarah laughed, the sound warm and real. I guess that's our cue to get back to work. Duty calls. James stood, offering her his hand. The simple act of helping her up felt different now, charged with meaning after sharing their fears and hopes. Their fingers lingered together a moment longer than necessary. They fell into their morning routine, but everything felt shifted, deeper somehow. James found himself sharing small stories as they worked, about growing up on the farm, his first cases as a lawyer, the moment he realized Birmingham didn't feel like home anymore. Each memory seemed to flow naturally into the next, as if telling Sarah was as easy as breathing. Watch out for, Sarah started to warn, but James was already sidestepping the water bucket. She raised an eyebrow. you remembered. Some things are coming back. He grinned at her surprise. Though I still maintain that bucket's been in the same spot since I was 10. His phone buzzed as they finished with the goats. Ethan, he said, checking the message. Olivia had a good night. Doctors are cautiously optimistic about making it another week. That's wonderful news. Sarah's smile was genuine, reminding James how seamlessly she'd become part of his family's concerns. They're talking about letting her come home if things stay stable. Bed rest, of course, but... He trailed off as Sarah stepped closer, brushing hay from his shoulder. But it would be easier on everyone to have her here, she finished. Her hand lingered on his arm. The hospital's wonderful, but there's something healing about being home. The warmth in her eyes made James's heart skip. It struck him suddenly how easy this was, sharing good news, working together, understanding each other without having to explain everything. When was the last time he'd felt this comfortable with someone? Speaking of home, Sarah said, checking her watch. I should head to the clinic. Morning appointments. Dinner tonight? The words came out before he could overthink them. I was thinking about trying that new place down by the harbor. The seafood place? Sarah's eyes lit up. I'd like that. Though. She bit her lip, looking uncertain for the first time that morning. Though? We could eat here instead. I could bring groceries, help with evening chores first. Her cheeks flushed slightly. If you want. James felt warmth spread through his chest. I'd like that better, actually. It's a date then. She gathered her medical bag, then turned back suddenly and pressed a quick kiss to his cheek. Thank you for sharing with me this morning. For trusting me with your fears about starting over. Thank you for making it so easy to trust you, he said softly. She smiled that bright smile that made his heart flip, then headed for her truck. James watched her drive away, touching his cheek where she'd kissed him. The morning sun was fully up now, painting the farm in shades of gold, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, everything felt possible. His phone buzzed again, another update from Ethan. But this time, reading about his family's challenges didn't fill him with that old anxiety. Instead, he felt grounded, certain. Ready to face whatever came next. After all, he wasn't facing it alone anymore. James heard Sarah's truck pull up just as he finished wiping down the kitchen counters. He'd spent the past half an hour alternating between cleaning and checking his phone for updates from Ethan, trying not to think about how much he was looking forward to this evening. The screen door creaked open, letting in a burst of cold air and Sarah's laughter. A little help, she called. I might have gone overboard at the grocery store. He found her juggling several bags, her cheeks pink from the cold, hair slightly windblown. Feeding an army? More like feeding a farmer. She handed him 2 of the bags. I figured after a day of chores, you'd be hungry enough for one. They moved into the kitchen together, the bags rustling as they unpacked them on the counter. Sarah had brought enough food for several meals. There were fresh vegetables, pasta, a loaf of bread from the bakery, and what looked like ingredients for dessert. I thought you said you weren't much of a cook, James teased, pulling out a bottle of wine. I'm not. But I can follow a recipe. She produced one written in Miss Doris's distinctive handwriting. And I have it on good authority that this pasta dish is, and I quote, foolproof enough that even that city lawyer can't mess it up. James smiled at Miss Doris's assessment. Actually, about those chores. Right. Sarah was already reaching for her coat. We should do those first. Work before pleasure and all that. Already done. He caught her hand before she could button up. Finished everything early. You did? Sarah's eyebrows shot up. He shrugged. Made sense to do them before it got too dark and cold. Everyone seemed ready. Sarah grinned. As cold as it is, I'm not surprised. I should go check on my patients though. James chuckled. I had a feeling you'd want to check on Betsy and Lincoln anyway. Lincoln? He was born on our farm, under my care. James felt his ears warm. I always admired our 16th president. He was a lawyer too. Lincoln, Sarah repeated softly, a smile tugging at her lips. I like it. And yes, I would like to check on them, if you don't mind? I figured as much. He grabbed a flashlight from the drawer. That's why I waited to bring them their evening treat. The night air was crisp as they made their way to the barn, their shoulders brushing as they walked. James found himself hyper-aware of her presence beside him, of how natural it felt to share these simple moments. The barn was warm and quiet, filled with soft animal sounds and the sweet scent of fresh hay. James watched Sarah move through her checkup with practiced ease, her hands gentle as she examined both mother and calf. Lincoln's thriving, she said, scratching behind the calf's ears. You've done a great job with them. I had a good teacher. He handed her one of the apples he'd brought, watching as she offered it to Betsy. Though I'm starting to think these evening checks are just an excuse to spoil them. Says the man who named the calf and brings them treats. But her smile was fond as she straightened up. They really are doing well, James. You're a natural at this. Something about the way she said his name, the warmth in her voice, made his heart skip. Standing there in the barn's soft lighting, Sarah's hair catching the golden glow, James felt a sense of rightness settle over him. This was what had been missing in Birmingham, not just the farm itself, but these quiet moments, this feeling of belonging. Ready to test our cooking skills? He asked, reluctant to break the spell, but aware of their waiting ingredients. As ready as I'll ever be. Sarah gave Lincoln one final pat. Though I should warn you. The last time I tried to cook for someone, the fire department got involved. Now that sounds like a story worth hearing. James held the barn door for her, catching the scent of her shampoo as she passed. Maybe after we successfully make dinner. She bumped his shoulder playfully. Assuming we do succeed. They walked back to the house together, their laughter carrying across the quiet farmyard. The kitchen lights glowed welcomingly through the windows, promising warmth and whatever the evening might bring. Back in the kitchen, James uncorked the wine while Sarah laid out ingredients with the focused attention he assumed she usually reserved for medical procedures. Okay, she said, studying Miss Doris's recipe. First step, chop vegetables while the water boils. She glanced at him. How are your knife skills, counselor? Better than my milking machine skills. He picked up a knife, demonstrating a perfect julienne on a red pepper. Mom had us helping in the kitchen growing up. With a large garden, she needed all the help she could get preserving the harvest. Sarah's eyebrows rose appreciatively. A man of hidden talents. She moved to the stove, brushing past him in the small kitchen. I'll handle the sauce then, since that's supposedly foolproof. They fell into an easy rhythm, working around each other as if they'd done this 100 times before. James chopped vegetables while Sarah mixed herbs and spices, their movements a comfortable dance in the warm kitchen. Every so often, their hands would brush as they reached for ingredients, each touch sending little sparks through him. So about that fire department story, James prompted, sliding chopped garlic her way. Sarah laughed, the sound rich and genuine. Would you believe it involved trying to impress a date with flambe? Somehow that doesn't surprise me. He watched her taste the sauce, a small frown of concentration on her face. How'd that work out? Well, I'm cooking with you instead of him, so. She reached for more basil, and a strand of hair fell across her face. Without thinking, James reached out to tuck it behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her skin, and Sarah's breath caught. For a moment, they just looked at each other, the kitchen suddenly feeling very small and very warm. Then the water boiled over, breaking the spell. The pasta. Sarah turned quickly to the stove, lowering the heat. Though at least nothing's on fire this time. James chuckled, returning to his vegetables. Yet. The night is young. They worked side by side, trading stories about kitchen disasters and childhood memories. Sarah told him about learning to bake with her grandmother, while James shared tales of competitive family dinners with his brothers. A pinch more oregano, he suggested, peering over her shoulder at the sauce. Sarah shooed him away with a wooden spoon. I thought we agreed you were on vegetable duty. This sauce is my domain. I'm just saying, a little more. James Winter, if you touch my sauce, all bets are off. But her eyes sparkled with amusement. I can tell how heavy-handed you are with seasonings. Ethan warned me about the great chili incident of 2010. That chili won first prize at the Harvest Festival, he protested. Only because half the judges had burned off their taste buds. She tasted the sauce again, then grudgingly reached for the oregano. Though maybe a tiny pinch more. James wisely kept his triumphant smile to himself, instead reaching around her for the wine bottle to refill their glasses. Sarah's soft "thank you" and the way she leaned slightly into him made his heart flip. The kitchen filled with warm aromas and easy conversation, punctuated by Sarah's occasional cooking directions and James's playful challenges to her culinary authority. When she dabbed a bit of sauce on his nose in retaliation for backseat cooking, he caught her hand, pulling her closer. "Careful, Dr. Walker," he murmured. "I know where the flour is kept." Sarah's laugh rang through the kitchen. "Are you threatening a food fight, Mr. Winter?" "Just stating facts." But he didn't let go of her hand, and she didn't pull away. They stood like that for a moment, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her hazel eyes, the kitchen warm and full of possibilities. "The sauce," Sarah said softly, though she made no move to step back. "What about it?" "It's going to burn if we don't," she gestured vaguely toward the stove with her free hand. "We can't have that." James reluctantly released her, immediately missing her warmth. Not after all that oregano debate. Sarah turned back to the stove, but her cheeks were flushed pink. "Find some plates? Unless you'd prefer to eat straight from the pot. We're civilized people." He reached for the cabinet where his mother kept her good dishes. "We at least need forks." By the time they plated the pasta, the playful tension had shifted into something softer, more intimate. Sarah found candles in a drawer, "Very Martha Stewart of your mom to keep them on hand," she'd teased, and their gentle glow added to the cozy atmosphere as they settled at the kitchen table. "More of an emergency supply," James said. "We lose power during the strong storms." "I have to admit," Sarah said, taking her first bite, "we make a pretty good team." This actually turned out edible. High praise indeed. James smiled over his wine glass. "Though I notice you're still guarding that sauce recipe. A girl has to maintain some mystery." She twirled pasta around her fork. "Besides, it's Miss Doris's secret weapon. I'm sworn to secrecy." They ate in comfortable silence for a moment, the only sounds the clink of cutlery and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Outside, an owl called softly into the night. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah's voice was thoughtful. "If anything were possible, if there were no expectations, no obligations, what would you really want to do?" James considered the question, surprised by how quickly the answer came. "I'd stay here," he said simply. "Open a small practice on the island, maybe take on environmental cases. Help protect places like this." He gestured vaguely toward the window, where the farm stretched dark and peaceful. "Build something that matters." "And the Birmingham law firm? The partner track? Feels like someone else's dream now." He met her eyes across the table. "What about you? If anything were possible?" Sarah traced the rim of her wine glass. "I'd expand the practice. Build a proper large animal clinic here on the island, something that could serve the whole area. Maybe take on some research projects, work with the wildlife refuge on the mainland." "You've thought about this before." "I have." She smiled softly. "The island has a way of making you dream bigger and smaller at the same time, you know? Like the dreams themselves become more focused, more real." "I know exactly what you mean." James reached across the table, taking her hand. "When I first came home, I thought I was just running away from Birmingham, from everything that happened with Claire. But being here, working the farm, spending time with you." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "It's like I can see a different kind of future. Something simpler, but somehow more meaningful. With early morning farm chores and midnight veterinary calls?" Sarah's tone was teasing, but her eyes were serious. with all of it. He squeezed her fingers. The hard work, the quiet moments, the sense of really belonging somewhere. Of building something lasting. It suits you, she said softly. The island. The farm. This life. You suit me, James replied, the words coming straight from his heart. I know it's fast, and maybe I'm crazy for even thinking about completely changing my life, but sometimes you just know. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. Sometimes home finds you when you least expect it. James couldn't take his eyes off her face, wondering how this woman he'd known for such a short time could understand him so completely. The candles had burned low, casting dancing shadows across the kitchen, and he realized they'd been talking for hours. Sarah glanced at her watch and sighed. I should go. Early rounds tomorrow. Right. But neither of them moved immediately, letting the moment linger in the candlelit kitchen, neither willing to be the first to end it. Finally, Sarah stood, gathering her coat. Thank you for dinner. Even if you did try to hijack my sauce. Thank you for cooking with me. James helped her with her coat, his fingers brushing the nape of her neck. And for everything else. They stepped out into the clear December night, the stars scattered like diamonds across the dark sky. The air was crisp and still, their breath visible in small clouds. James walked her to her truck, their footsteps crunching on frozen grass. At the driver's door, Sarah turned to face him, her eyes reflecting starlight. I had a wonderful time tonight. Stay a little longer? The words slipped out before he could stop them. She smiled, reaching up to straighten his collar. We both know if I do, I'll never want to leave. James caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. Would that be so terrible? No, she whispered. That's what scares me. He stepped closer, cupping her face with his free hand. When their lips met, it was soft and sweet and unhurried. Different from their mistletoe kiss at the market, this was a kiss that felt like coming home, like promise and possibility and everything he never knew he wanted. Sarah sighed against his mouth, her fingers curling into his sweater. When they finally parted, she kept her eyes closed for a moment, a small smile playing at her lips. Good night, James, she said softly, finally looking up at him. Good night, Sarah. He opened her door, waiting until she was safely inside before stepping back. She started the engine but rolled down her window. See you in the morning? I'll have coffee waiting. Her smile was bright enough to rival the stars as she drove away. James stood in the farmyard long after her taillights disappeared, his heart full of something that felt remarkably like hope. He lingered until the cold finally drove him inside. The kitchen still held traces of their evening, wine glasses on the table, the lingering scent of herbs and garlic, Sarah's forgotten recipe card propped against the salt shaker. He started to clear up, but his eyes kept drifting to his briefcase, where he knew his legal pad waited. Finally giving in to the urge, he settled at the kitchen table, pulling out a pen and fresh sheet of paper. The same table where he'd done homework as a kid, where his father had worked out farm finances, where he and Sarah had just shared dinner, it felt right to plan his future here. He started writing, ideas flowing faster than he could capture them. Environmental law focusing on coastal protection. Help for small businesses navigating regulations. Legal support for family farms dealing with development pressure. His experience in corporate law could actually help protect the things that made the island special. And then there was the never-ending need for family law in a place like this. Wills, trusts, divorce, and the occasional adoption case. The list grew, becoming more detailed. He'd need an office, maybe that empty space next to the roasted bean? Carol, his paralegal in Birmingham, had family in Charleston. Maybe she'd consider relocating. He could start small, build something sustainable. James sat back, looking at the pages of notes he'd generated. In Birmingham, every plan had been about growing bigger, reaching higher, impressing more people. But this was about putting down roots. About using his skills to protect a place and people he loved. His phone buzzed, a text from Sarah made it home safe. Thanks for a perfect evening. James smiled, adding one more item to his list: build a life worth sharing. For the first time since leaving Birmingham, since ending things with Claire, since questioning every choice that had led him to this point, James felt completely certain. This wasn't running away from his old life. This was running towards something better. He folded the pages carefully, tucking them into his briefcase. Tomorrow he'd start making calls, taking actual steps toward this new future. But for now, he simply sat in his family's kitchen, listening to the familiar creaks and sighs of the old farmhouse, feeling more at home than he had in years. Outside, an owl called into the night. From the barn came the soft lowing of cattle. And somewhere on the island, a beautiful veterinarian was falling asleep, maybe dreaming of shared dinners and candlelight and possibilities. James smiled, gathering the wine glasses to wash. Tomorrow would bring what it brought: early morning farm chores, Sarah's visit, perhaps news about Olivia and the baby. But tonight, he let himself believe in the future taking shape in his heart, one that looked nothing like he'd planned and everything like he needed. Chapter 6. Sarah pulled up to the farmhouse right at 7, her heart doing a little flip when she saw James waiting on the porch with 2 stainless steel travel mugs. Last night's kiss lingered in her memory, making her hands tremble slightly as she cut the engine. "You're going to spoil me with all this coffee service," she said, climbing out of her truck. The morning air was crisp enough to see her breath, but James's smile warmed her more than any coffee could. "Seems fair. You spoiled me with dinner last night." He handed her a mug, and their fingers brushed. Neither pulled away immediately. They settled into their morning routine, checking on the animals while trading comfortable conversation and shy glances. Sarah tried to maintain some professional focus, but she kept getting distracted by the way James moved around the barn with increasing confidence, how his hand would find the small of her back as they walked between stalls, the lingering touches that seemed to come more naturally with each passing hour. "Lincoln's getting stronger every day," she said, watching the calf nurse. "You've done an amazing job with him." "We've done an amazing job," James corrected, stepping closer. "Though I still think." Her phone's sharp ring cut through the peaceful morning. Sarah checked the display, instantly alert at the caller ID. "Mrs. Patterson?" She pressed the phone to her ear, already moving toward her truck. "Slow down, Mary. What happened to Max?" James followed, his expression shifting from concern to alarmed as he heard the name. "Max? Mary Patterson's golden retriever?" Sarah nodded, listening intently. "We'll be right there. Keep him still if you can." She ended the call, turning to James. "He's hurt, got tangled in some old fencing behind her house. She's afraid to move him." "I'm coming with you." It wasn't a question. Mary Patterson's husband was my little league coach. She brings cookies to the farm every Christmas. "I know." Sarah was already climbing into her truck. "She mentioned them both last week when I gave Max his shots." "Hop in, she's pretty shaken up." James slid into the passenger seat, his knee bouncing with nervous energy as Sarah drove. "Max is getting old," he said quietly. "Must be 12, 13 now? I remember when they got him as a puppy. Their grandson picked him out." Sarah reached over and squeezed his hand. "Don't worry. I'll take good care of him." The words were as much for herself as for him. On the small island, the care of her patients felt more personal than it had before. They pulled up to the modest white house with its wraparound porch, where Mary Patterson stood wringing her hands. Her silver hair was still in curlers, a faded robe pulled hastily over her nightgown. "Oh, Sarah, thank goodness." Mary's voice quivered. "And James Winter? Is that really you?" "It's me, Mrs. Patterson." James was already out of the truck, giving the elderly woman's shoulder a gentle squeeze. "Where's Max?" "Back here." She led them around the house, her worn slippers shuffling through the dewy grass. "He got out early, he needs his morning constitutional at exactly 6:30, you know how he is, and I heard him yelping." Sarah grabbed her medical bag, following them to where the yard backed up to an old storage shed. Max lay on his side, his golden coat dulled with age, one leg caught in rusted fencing that had partially collapsed. His tail thumped weakly against the ground when he saw them. "Hey, sweet boy," Sarah said softly, approaching slowly to assess the situation. The dog's leg was tangled and she hoped it wasn't broken. "There's some blood where the metal had cut into him. Remember me, Max?" James knelt beside the dog's head, scratching behind his ears exactly where Sarah knew Max liked it best. The old retriever's tongue lolled out, his eyes fixed trustingly on James. "Mrs. Patterson's Christmas cookies are still the best on the island, aren't they?" "Oh, you." Mary dabbed at her eyes with her robe sleeve. "Those should be ready next week, if you're going to be around. Wouldn't miss them." James kept petting Max, his voice steady and calm, while Sarah examined the fencing. "I'm going to need help getting him free," Sarah said. "The fencing's wrapped pretty tight, and I don't want him struggling while I work." She looked at James. "Think you can keep him still? Tell me what you need." Sarah worked carefully, using wire cutters from her truck to slowly free Max's leg while James kept him calm. The dog whimpered once or twice, but stayed remarkably still, as if he understood they were helping. "Almost there, buddy," James murmured, his voice low and soothing. Max responded by trying to lick his face. When the last wire finally gave way, Sarah ran her hands gently over the leg, checking for breaks. "No fractures, thank goodness. But these cuts need cleaning and stitching." She looked up at Mrs. Patterson. "I'd like to take him to the clinic, get him properly treated, and start him on antibiotics." "Oh dear." Mary twisted her robe belt anxiously. "I don't drive much anymore, especially not this early, and my daughter won't be here until this afternoon." "I'll take Max back with me," Sarah reassured her. "And I'll go with them," James said immediately. "Stay right with him the whole time." "You will?" Mary's relief was palpable. "You always were such a good boy, James Winter. Your mama raised you right." It's settled then. Sarah was already preparing a mild sedative to keep Max comfortable during transport. "James, can you help me lift him into the truck? I have a blanket we can use as a sling." They worked together to carefully move Max, who seemed to take it all in stride, especially when James climbed into the back seat next to him. "We'll have him back home before you know it," Sarah assured Mrs. Patterson. "Why don't you go in and get dressed? By the time you're ready, we should be done." "I'll make coffee," Mary said, patting Sarah's arm. "And I think I have some of those cranberry muffins you like in the freezer, James. They'll be thawed by the time you bring my boy back." Sarah caught James's eye in the rearview mirror as they pulled away, Max's head resting contentedly in his lap. His smile was soft and a little sad. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah." He stroked Max's graying muzzle. "Just remembering all the times I played catch with him in this yard. Coach Patterson used to say Max was the best outfielder on the team." The early morning sun cast long shadows as Sarah drove toward her clinic, taking the bumps in the road as carefully as possible. Every few minutes she glanced in the rearview mirror, her heart warming at the sight of James talking softly to Max, keeping the old dog calm and distracted. "Almost there, buddy." James looked up, catching her eye in the mirror again. "How bad are the cuts?" "Nothing too deep, thankfully. But at his age, we need to be careful about infection." She turned onto the quiet street where her small clinic sat. "He's going to need some stitches and antibiotics, maybe a few follow-up visits." "Mrs. Patterson will worry about the cost," James said quietly. "I know." Sarah pulled around to the back entrance. "But we'll figure something out. We always do." The clinic was dark and quiet, her first appointment not due for another hour. Sarah flicked on lights as they made their way to the exam room, the familiar space comforting in its simplicity. It wasn't fancy like her Atlanta practice had been, but it was hers, and it was exactly what the island needed. "You can put him right on the table," she said, already gathering supplies. "Keep talking to him. He's doing great with you." James lifted Max with surprising gentleness, murmuring encouragement as the dog settled on the exam table. Remember when you stole Coach's hot dog right off the grill that 4th of July? Nearly gave Mrs. Patterson a heart attack. Max's tail thumped against the metal table. Sarah worked efficiently, cleaning the cuts, while James kept Max distracted with stories of baseball games and beach runs and Christmas cookies. The old dog barely flinched as she put in the stitches, too focused on James's familiar voice and gentle hands. "You're good with him," she said, finishing the last stitch. "Most dogs his age would be a lot more stressed about all this." "He's a good boy." James smiled as Max tried to lick his face again. "Aren't you, Max?" "The very best boy." Sarah prepared an antibiotic injection, then wrote out careful instructions for aftercare. "We'll need to change the bandages daily for a few days. I can stop by after rounds." "I can help," James offered. "I mean, I'm right here on the island now. Maybe we could take turns?" The way he said it, "I'm right here," made Sarah's heart flutter. She busied herself with the bandages, trying not to read too much into his words. "That would be great, actually. Mrs. Patterson would love the visits." "That settles it. I'll take the morning shift. Even if it means missing out on coffee with my favorite vet." His voice was warm, and when Sarah looked up, his eyes held that soft expression that made her forget what she was doing. Max chose that moment to shake himself thoroughly, breaking the spell. "Okay, big guy." Sarah laughed, checking Max's bandages. "Let's get you home." James's phone buzzed as he helped Max down from the exam table. His sharp intake of breath made Sarah turn. "Ethan?" she asked, recognizing the sudden tension in his shoulders. He nodded, staring at his phone. "Olivia's contractions are back. Strong ones this time." Sarah moved closer, reading the worry in his face. After last night's dinner, after this morning with Max, she found it increasingly difficult to maintain professional distance when James was hurting. "Here." She handed him Max's leash. "Why don't you walk him to the truck while I get his medications together? Moving helps with anxiety, both his and yours." A ghost of a smile touched James's lips. "Prescribing treatment for both of us, Dr. Walker? Professional privilege." She squeezed his arm. "Go on. Fresh air will do you good." While James walked Max outside, Sarah gathered antibiotics and care instructions, adding detailed notes about changing bandages and watching for signs of infection. Keeping busy helped push down her own worry about Olivia and the baby. About how this might affect the tentative future taking shape between her and James. She found them waiting by her truck, James absently scratching behind Max's ears while checking his phone again. "No news is good news," she said softly, loading her supplies into the back. "And Olivia's in the best possible hands." "I know." He helped Max into the back seat, movements gentle, despite his obvious distraction. "I just feel like I should be doing something." "You are." Sarah caught his hand before he could reach for his phone again. "You're taking care of things here, which is exactly what Ethan needs right now. And in about 10 minutes, you're going to enjoy Mrs. Patterson's muffins and let her fuss over both you and Max, because that's what this community does. We take care of each other." James looked at their joined hands, then back at her face. Something shifted in his expression, like pieces falling into place. "What would I do without you?" "Probably still be wrestling with that milking machine." She kept her tone light but squeezed his fingers before letting go. "Come on. Max's pain medication will be kicking in soon, and he should be home when it does." They drove back to the Pattersons' house in comfortable silence, broken only by Max's occasional contented sighs from the back seat. Sarah couldn't help noticing how James's knee had stopped its nervous bouncing, how his breathing had steadied to match the old dog's rhythm. Sometimes the best medicine wasn't medicine at all. Sometimes it was just having someone to share the worry with, someone to remind you that you weren't alone. "Thank you," James said quietly, checking his phone for what had to be the 100th time that afternoon. "For keeping me busy today." Sarah looked up from wrapping an elderly cat's sprained paw. "I should be thanking you. The supply cabinet hasn't been this organized since, well, ever." Just trying to be useful. He slipped the phone back in his pocket, but his fingers twitched like they wanted to check it again. There you go, sweet girl. She scratched under the cat's chin. All set, Mrs. Thompson. Just keep her quiet for a few days, no jumping on counters. Thank you, Dr. Walker. Mrs. Thompson gathered her cat into her arms. James Winter, I hardly recognized you without your suit and tie. How long are you staying on the island? Sarah watched James's polite smile as he answered, noting how his hand automatically went to check his phone the moment Mrs. Thompson left. No messages. She could tell by the way his shoulders stayed tense. The shelf labels are color-coded now, he said, clearly trying to distract himself. Blue for bandages, green for medications, red for emergency supplies. I'm impressed. She moved to stand beside him, checking out his handiwork. Though I have to warn you, the next time I'm out on a midnight emergency call, I'll probably just grab whatever's closest. At least you'll know where to find it. His attempted smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Sarah touched his arm gently. Thank you for helping today. I know keeping busy doesn't make the waiting easier, but it helps. He turned to face her, close enough that she could see the worry lines around his eyes. Thank you for letting me hide out here. For giving me things to do besides stare at my phone. The late afternoon sun slanted through the clinic windows, reminding them both of passing time. James checked his phone again, then sighed. I should probably head back to the farm, he said reluctantly. Evening chores won't do themselves. I can come with you, Sarah offered, surprising herself. My last appointment cancelled, and I should check on Lincoln anyway. You've already spent your whole day babysitting me. But she could see the hope in his eyes, the way some of the tension left his shoulders at her offer. Professional responsibility, she reminded him with a smile. Can't have my star pupil forgetting how to work the milking machine just when he's finally gotten the hang of it. James's phone rang, cutting through their gentle teasing. Sarah's heart jumped when she saw him stiffen, recognizing Ethan's ringtone. Ethan? James answered, his voice tight. Is everything? He went quiet, listening, and Sarah found herself holding her breath. Then his face transformed, relief and joy washing over his features. A girl? His voice cracked slightly. And they're both. That's amazing news. He ran a hand through his hair, catching Sarah's eye. How big is she? Sarah could only hear one side of the conversation, but James's expression told her everything she needed to know. She busied herself straightening supplies, giving him a moment with his brother while staying close enough to offer support. Of course they want to keep her in the NICU, no, don't worry about the farm. I've got it handled. He glanced at Sarah. We've got it handled. Just take care of Olivia and that little girl. When he finally ended the call, James stood perfectly still for a moment, as if absorbing the news. I'm an uncle, he said softly, wonder and worry mixed in his voice. She's tiny, just over 4 pounds, but the doctors say she's strong. They'll need to keep her for a while, but... He trailed off, emotion overtaking him. Sarah stepped closer, laying a hand on his arm. Congratulations, Uncle James. His hand covered hers, warm and slightly trembling. I don't know whether to laugh or cry. Both are perfectly acceptable. Sarah squeezed his arm. Did they pick a name? Charlotte Rose. A smile spread across his face. After both their grandmothers. Ethan says she's got a head full of dark hair and her mother's chin. She sounds perfect. Sarah started gathering her things, knowing James would want to get to the farm and share the news. Did Ethan say how Olivia's doing? Tired but good. They're moving her to a regular room soon. He helped Sarah with her coat, his movements charged with restless energy. I should call Daniel and Mark. God, I wish Mom and Dad weren't still on that cruise. They're not due back until the day after tomorrow. Though maybe it's better, Mom would be trying to reorganize the entire NICU by now. Sarah laughed, picturing Maggie Winter taking charge of the hospital staff. She'll be home soon enough to spoil her granddaughter properly. They headed for the parking lot, Sarah pausing to lock up the clinic. The December evening was settling in early, Christmas lights starting to twinkle in shop windows along the street. "Want to follow me out to the farm?" she asked. "Or would you rather ride together?" Together? There was something vulnerable in the way he asked, like he wasn't ready to be alone with all these emotions just yet. Sarah nodded, unlocking her truck. Together. Chapter 7. The morning sun hadn't quite cleared the tree line when James heard Sarah's truck in the drive. He and Ethan were in the barn, falling into the familiar rhythm of their childhood, one feeding, one milking, though his brother's occasional yawns suggested he hadn't gotten as much sleep as he'd hoped. "You know you didn't have to get up for chores," James said, watching Ethan struggle with a hay bale. "Couldn't sleep anyway. Too weird being home without Olivia." Ethan managed a tired smile. "Besides, I figured I should check that you haven't completely reorganized the farm while I was gone." "That would be my fault," Sarah said, appearing in the doorway with 3 travel mugs. "I might have encouraged his organizational tendencies. Keeping the man busy." "Bless you," Ethan said, reaching for one of the coffees. "Though I'm pretty sure the color-coded feeding charts are all him." James felt his ears warm, but before he could defend his system, headlights swept across the barn entrance. A car door slammed, followed by his mother's unmistakable voice. "Is that my boys I hear in there?" James exchanged a startled look with Ethan. "They're not supposed to be back until late this evening." "Got off as fast as we could," his father's deeper voice carried through the morning air. "Couldn't very well stay on a cruise ship when we had a granddaughter to meet." Their mother appeared in the barn doorway, still in her travel clothes, her usually perfectly styled hair windblown from the drive. "My boys," she beamed, then seemed to notice Sarah. "And Dr. Walker. What on earth are you doing here so early?" "Mom," James stepped forward, suddenly aware of how domestic this scene must look, Sarah bringing coffee, the easy way she fit into their morning routine. "Sarah's been helping with the farm while Ethan was at the hospital." "And keeping this one in line," Ethan added, accepting their mother's fierce hug. "James Winter, needing keeping in line? Now that's not the son I remember." Their father strode in, looking tired but happy. "Henry Winter," he held out his hand to Sarah. "Though I suppose you already knew that, being our vet and all." "It's nice to finally meet you both," Sarah said, her professional smile warming into something more genuine. "Your sons speak very highly of you." "As they should." Their mother finally released Ethan, turning her attention to James. "And you, coming home early without telling us. Though I suppose it's lucky you did, with everything happening with the baby." James hugged her, breathing in the familiar scent of her perfume mixed with sea air. "We managed. Sarah's been a huge help with the farm, keeping me busy and fed." "More than that," Ethan said. "She helped deliver Betsy's calf, got the milking machine working properly." "The milking machine?" Their father's eyebrows shot up. "You got James close to that thing?" "Dad," James protested, though he couldn't help smiling at Sarah's poorly hidden laugh. "Well," his mother said, looking around the immaculate barn with its newly labeled equipment and color-coded charts, "I'd say some things have changed while we were away." Her keen eyes moved between James and Sarah, noting something that made her smile softly. "All for the better, it seems." James coughed and Sarah's cheeks turned a lovely shade of pink. "I don't know about that," Ethan muttered under his breath, giving the charts the side eye. "Sarah," Maggie touched her arm gently. "Thank you for taking care of my boys and our farm. I know how much work it must have been, especially with your own practice to run." "It was my pleasure, Mrs. Winter." Sarah's cheeks flushed slightly. "Your family's made me feel very welcome on the island." "Maggie, please." She gestured at the pristine barn. "Anyone who can get James to organize feed schedules is practically family." James caught Sarah's eye over his mother's head, his heart warming at her soft smile. He watched as she gracefully excused herself to check on Lincoln and Betsy, giving them space for their reunion. "Now then," Maggie turned to Ethan, her travel weariness forgotten, "tell me everything about my granddaughter." Those hospital photos don't show enough detail. How's she feeding? Is she responding well to the treatments? She's doing better than expected, Ethan said, pride breaking through his exhaustion. 4 pounds 3 ounces now. The nurses say she's got quite a grip. Wrapped her whole hand around my finger yesterday. That's our girl. Henry's gruff voice held emotion. And Olivia? She holding up okay? Tired but strong. We're both adjusting to parenthood. Ethan ran a hand through his hair. The doctors say if all goes well, they might get to come home this week. James watched Sarah quietly move deeper into the barn, checking on animals while his family huddled closer together. She worked efficiently, giving them space while staying within earshot in case they needed anything. We'll need to get the house ready, Maggie was saying. And speaking of being home. She turned to James. What made you decide to come back early? Any thoughts about making this return more permanent? James felt his father's sharp look, but for once, the question didn't raise his usual defenses. I'm considering my options, he said carefully, aware of Sarah pausing briefly in her work before continuing to measure feed. Well, the island could use a good lawyer, Henry said. Someone who understands farming contracts. And it would be nice to have all my boys home, Maggie added. Especially with a granddaughter in the picture. The conversation shifted back to Charlotte, her dark hair, her tiny features, how the nurses said she was the most alert baby in the NICU. James half listened, his attention drawn to Sarah as she quietly finished her morning checks and gathered her medical bag. She moved so naturally through the barn, so much a part of his morning routine that seeing her prepare to leave made his chest tighten. His family's voices faded into background noise as he watched her slip toward the door, clearly trying not to interrupt their reunion. Excuse me, he said, though he doubted anyone but Ethan noticed as he followed her out. James had just reached the barn door when his phone rang. The Birmingham office number made his stomach clench. Take it, Sarah said softly, already moving toward her truck. I need to check on Max anyway. He nodded, watching her go as he answered. James Winter. James, thank God. Carol's voice held barely contained panic. The Morrison merger is imploding. The SEC filing deadline is December 31st, and the Hong Kong investors are threatening to pull out. He pinched the bridge of his nose, the familiar tension headache already building. Carol, I'm not. I know you're dealing with family matters, his senior partner cut in, but you're the only one who understands the regulatory implications of the Asian markets. Wilson's completely out of his depth. I'll get Carol to send you the latest paperwork. The morning sun suddenly felt too bright, the peaceful farm sounds jarring against the sharp corporate crisis unfolding in his ear. Sarah's truck pulled away as Joe detailed the mounting disasters, each one requiring immediate attention, immediate decisions. The partners are meeting in an hour, she finished. We need you on the video call. The whole deal could fall apart if we don't. I'll dial in, he heard himself say, already walking toward the house. The familiar pull of high-stakes litigation tugged at him, even as something in his chest ached watching Sarah's truck disappear down the drive. Inside the farmhouse, James booted up his laptop, muscle memory taking over as he pulled up documents he'd worked on for months. The Morrison merger had been his baby, complex international regulations, multiple jurisdictions, the kind of challenge he'd built his career on. His phone buzzed with rapid-fire texts from the associates, questions he could answer in his sleep. The familiar adrenaline kicked in, his mind already racing through solutions, contingency plans, ways to salvage the deal. Everything okay? Ethan appeared in the doorway, concern etched on his tired face. Work crisis. James loosened his collar, the worn flannel suddenly feeling wrong against his skin. I need to take this call. Of course. Ethan hesitated. But James? Don't let them pull you all the way back in. The farm will still be here when you're done. The gentle reminder struck something in James's chest. Through the window, he could see his parents walking the property, his father pointing out changes, his mother already making plans for Charlotte's arrival. The life he'd been building here these past weeks felt suddenly fragile against the weight of his Birmingham obligations. His laptop chimed with the incoming video call. James straightened his shoulders, lawyer mode engaging automatically. But as faces filled his screen, demanding answers and direction, he couldn't quite shake the image of Sarah driving away, or the quiet peace he'd felt just an hour ago, doing simple chores with his family. James? Joe's voice cut through his thoughts. We need your decision on this. He drew a deep breath, corporate mask sliding into place. Pull up the regulatory filing. Let's start there. James ended the video call 4 hours later, his head pounding. The Morrison merger was stabilized, for now, but the familiar weight of corporate deadlines and client demands settled heavy on his shoulders. His comfortable flannel shirt felt like a costume, a temporary escape from reality. He found his parents in the kitchen, sharing coffee and thumbing through photos of Charlotte on their phones. The scene was so domestic, so removed from the high-stakes conference call he'd just finished, that he almost felt dizzy from the contrast. Everything okay at the office? His mother asked, looking up from her phone. You were in there quite a while. Just year-end complications. He sank into a kitchen chair, the wood worn smooth by generations of winters. Speaking of complications, his mother set her phone down carefully. We were surprised to find you here early. Is Claire okay with you being away from Birmingham so long? The question caught him off guard. He hadn't told them about the breakup, hadn't told them much of anything lately, he realized with a pang of guilt. Claire and I. He paused, gathering his thoughts. We ended things. About 6 months ago. Oh, James. His mother's face filled with concern. Why didn't you tell us? You were planning your cruise. And it wasn't. He ran a hand through his hair. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. We just realized we wanted different things. Different things? His father's voice was gentle, encouraging. She took a position with an international firm in London. I was supposed to make partner. The words came easier now, maybe because he'd already shared them with Sarah. We'd been growing apart for a while, we just didn't want to admit it. His mother reached across the table, squeezing his hand. And that's why you came home early? Partly. James stared into his coffee cup. I needed some time to figure things out. Where I belong, what I really want. And have you? His father's keen eyes studied him. Figured it out? The question hung in the air, heavy with possibility. James thought of his color-coded charts in the barn, of Sarah's smile over morning coffee, of the peace he'd found in simple chores and island rhythms. Then he thought of his corner office, his client obligations, the career he'd spent 15 years building. I'm just taking some time, he said finally, the words tasting like compromise. Helping out while Ethan needs me. His mother nodded, but his father's gaze held something else, understanding, maybe. Or recognition. James stood, suddenly needing air. I should check on the animals. Actually, Henry pushed back from the table, we should head to Charleston. Ethan says Olivia is up for a visit, and I'd like to meet my granddaughter. Give me half an hour, his mother said, reaching for one of the suitcases still sitting on the floor. I want to change and pack up those little outfits I picked up in Myrtle Beach before we left. And I need to make up a care package for Olivia, some of those herbal teas she likes, maybe those shortbread cookies. We can take my car, James offered, grateful for the brief reprieve. He needed to clear his head before facing the hospital, and all it represented about his changing life. Good idea, his father said. I'll get unpacked, unless you want some help out there. He shook his head. There isn't much left to do. I'll just make sure everything's secure before we leave. James walked out into the crisp December air, his mind spinning. In the barn, morning sunlight slanted through the windows, catching on the color-coded labels. He touched one gently, remembering how she'd teased him about his organizational tendencies at her practice. The memory contrasted sharply with his corporate crisis management this morning, both sides of himself, both feeling real and foreign at the same time. His phone buzzed with another email from the office. More demands, more deadlines, more of the life he'd built in Birmingham. But standing here in the quiet barn, surrounded by the evidence of the life he could have, morning coffee with Sarah, working the farm with his brothers, being present for his niece's childhood, he wasn't sure which path was the escape anymore. The familiar sights and sounds of the farm should have been soothing, but it only heightened his sense of division. He found himself moving on autopilot, his mind caught between worlds, checking feed levels while mentally reviewing regulatory deadlines, measuring supplements while composing email responses in his head. Lincoln walked over to the fence, no longer unsteady on his long legs. James scratched behind his ears, remembering the night he was born, how natural it had felt working alongside Sarah. The calf butted against his hand, demanding more attention. "Some things don't change, do they?" he murmured. Animals didn't care about merger deadlines or partner tracks. They needed what they needed, simple and straightforward. His phone buzzed again. Without looking, he knew it would be another urgent message from Birmingham. The Morrison deal wasn't their only year-end crisis, and his temporary absence had clearly created waves he hadn't anticipated. But as he moved through the barn, he realized something else he hadn't anticipated: how right this felt. Not just the farm work itself, but the rhythm of island life. Morning coffee with Sarah, helping neighbors like Mrs. Patterson, being part of a community that valued connection over convenience. The corporate law world he'd built in Birmingham suddenly felt like an elaborate construction, a carefully maintained facade. Here, mucking stalls in his work boots, he felt more genuine than he had in years. His father's words echoed in his mind: the island could use a good lawyer. Maybe there was a way to bridge these worlds, to use his skills without losing this sense of purpose he'd found. For a moment, James considered calling Sarah. She'd want to know about his impromptu trip to Charleston, might even want to come along. But after this morning's corporate crisis and his hasty goodbye, asking felt presumptuous. Besides, his parents would read too much into it if he invited her. Instead, he did one final check of the barn before heading to the house. His mother had a basket packed with what looked like enough supplies for a week, not just the baby clothes and Olivia's favorite tea, homemade jam, muffins she'd pulled out of the freezer, and various other comfort items she deemed essential. "Ready?" his father asked, handing him the keys. The drive to Charleston passed in a blur of his parents' excited chatter. His mother read every text update from Ethan out loud, debating the meaning of each detail about Charlotte's weight gain and feeding schedule. His father kept up a steady stream of predictions about which winter traits their granddaughter would inherit. James made appropriate noises at all the right moments, but his mind kept drifting. He wondered if Sarah had made it to Mrs. Patterson's to check on Max. If she was disappointed about missing their usual morning routine. "James?" His mother's voice cut through his thoughts. "Did you hear me?" "Sorry," he shifted in his seat. "What was that?" "I asked if you thought Charlotte looks more like Ethan or Olivia in the photos." "Oh." He tried to focus on the conversation, on the joy of becoming an uncle, but his thoughts kept circling back to hazel eyes and gentle hands and the way Sarah's presence made everything feel possible. The highway stretched ahead, familiar, yet somehow foreign. James had driven this route countless times, but today it felt like more than just a road to Charleston. Each mile marker seemed to underscore his internal tug-of-war. His mother was reading another text from Ethan, something about Charlotte's first bath, but James barely registered the words. Instead, his mind wandered to this morning's corporate crisis. The ease with which he'd slipped back into that role frightened him a little. One phone call and he'd transformed from the man who helped deliver calves and organized barn supplies into the sharp corporate lawyer everyone expected him to be. But which version was real? The James who thrived on high-stakes negotiations and international mergers? Or the one who found peace in early morning farm chores and Sarah's quiet company? "Did I tell you? The nurses say she's the most alert baby in the NICU," his mother was saying proudly. "Must get that from our side of the family." James smiled automatically, guilt gnawing at him for not being more engaged in the conversation. He should be focusing on his niece, on supporting Ethan and Olivia. Instead, he kept thinking about the way Sarah's eyes crinkled when she smiled, how naturally she fit into his world, both worlds, really. She understood his drive for organization, his need to make things work properly, but she also showed him how to slow down, to appreciate simpler pleasures. The Morrison deal would make him partner. It was everything he'd worked toward, the path everyone expected him to take. His corner office in Birmingham was waiting, his career perfectly planned. So why did the thought of returning fill him with such dread? The time he'd spent on the island had awakened something in him, a longing for connection, for purpose beyond billable hours and corporate victories. The joy he'd found in small moments, morning coffee with Sarah, helping neighbors, being present for his family, felt more real than any courtroom triumph. "Weather's supposed to be clear through Christmas," his father commented, eyes on the road. "Good for visiting the baby." James nodded, wondering if his father had ever felt this torn, this caught between duty and desire. Had he ever considered leaving the farm, pursuing a different life? Or had he always known exactly where he belonged? Charleston's familiar skyline rose before them, glass towers gleaming in the winter sun. James felt the shift in the air, from island ease to city energy, and his shoulders tensed automatically. His mother was already on her phone, coordinating their hospital visit with Ethan. "Parking's on level 3, he says. And we need to check in at the security desk for NICU passes." The hospital protocols and procedures felt jarringly formal after the intimate routines of farm life. No casual dropping by with coffee here, no easy conversation over morning chores. Everything regulated, scheduled, controlled. As they pulled into the parking structure, James caught sight of his reflection in the rearview mirror. He'd changed into a button-down shirt before leaving the farm, but hadn't bothered with a tie. The man looking back at him seemed caught between two worlds, not quite the polished lawyer he'd been, not fully the island version he was becoming. "James?" His father's voice was gentle. "You coming, son?" He realized he was still sitting in the car, keys in hand, while his parents gathered the care package and baby clothes. "Yeah." He shook himself, pushing away thoughts of Sarah, of the farm, of decisions that would need to be made. Right now, his family needed him here, focused on Charlotte and Olivia. The rest could wait. But as they walked toward the hospital entrance, each step feeling heavier than the last, James couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking away from something important, something that felt remarkably like home. The NICU was eerily quiet except for the steady beeping of monitors and the soft murmur of nurses. James followed his parents through the strict sanitization protocols, watching his mother barely contain her excitement as Ethan led them to Charlotte's incubator. "There she is," Ethan said softly, pride and exhaustion mingling in his voice. "All 4 pounds, 3 ounces of her." James stepped closer, something catching in his throat at the sight of his niece. She was tiny, impossibly tiny, but perfect. Dark hair like Ethan's, Olivia's delicate features, tiny fingers curled up. As he watched, she yawned, and his heart did a funny little flip. "She's beautiful," their mother whispered, tears streaming freely down her face. Their father stood silent, one arm around his wife, the other gripping Ethan's shoulder. "Want to touch her?" Ethan asked, showing them how to reach through the incubator's ports. "She's stronger than she looks." James watched his parents take turns gently stroking Charlotte's arm, murmuring soft words of love and welcome. When his turn came, he was surprised by how natural it felt, this immediate, fierce love for this tiny person he'd just met. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said quietly. "I'm your Uncle James." Charlotte's fingers flexed, and he could have sworn she turned toward his voice. The simple gesture hit him harder than he expected. This was what mattered. Not merger deadlines or partner tracks, but family. Being here for moments like this. "She's got quite a grip," he managed, his voice rough with emotion. "Takes after her old man," Ethan said, but his own eyes were suspiciously bright. Chapter 8. The farmhouse was dark when they pulled in, the winter night having settled early. James's parents headed inside, his mother already planning a homecoming for Olivia and the baby, but he lingered in the yard, staring up at the stars. The day felt disjointed, fractured. The joy of meeting Charlotte, of seeing his brother so completely in love with his tiny daughter, sat alongside a persistent ache of regret. He should have called Sarah before leaving. Should have at least texted her about Charlotte. Instead, he'd let corporate chaos and family dynamics sweep him along, leaving her on the periphery. His phone felt heavy in his pocket. It wasn't that late. He could call now. But what would he say? Sorry, I disappeared after that work crisis? Sorry, I let you walk away this morning? Sorry, I'm terrible at balancing what matters? The barn stood quiet and orderly, evidence of her influence everywhere. The careful labels, the organized supplies, the sense of purpose she'd helped him find. How had he let someone become so essential to his happiness without fully acknowledging it? James walked to the fence where they'd shared so many morning conversations. The night air carried a hint of jasmine from the winter-blooming vine his mother had planted years ago. He remembered Sarah mentioning it was her favorite, the way her face lit up when she caught its scent. Quite a day, his father's voice came from behind him. James turned, wondering how long he'd been standing there lost in thought. Yes. Charlotte's amazing. She is. Henry moved to stand beside him at the fence. But that's not what's keeping you out here in the cold, is it? James was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. His father waited patiently, a habit formed over years of dealing with skittish farm animals and stubborn sons. I messed up today, James finally said. When that call came from Birmingham, I switched back into corporate lawyer mode. Like the past few weeks hadn't happened. Like Sarah hadn't happened. Ah. His father nodded slowly. You know, your mother and I noticed something different about you this visit. Even before we knew about Claire. There's a piece to you that wasn't there before. There was, James agreed, emphasis on the past tense. Until today. Because of the work crisis? Because I let it become a crisis. Because I dropped everything, dropped her, to jump back into that life. A life I'm not even sure I want anymore. The admission felt both frightening and freeing. His father was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the darkened pastures. You remember that summer I almost sold the farm? When the drought hit and feed prices skyrocketed? James nodded, surprised by the change in subject. I had an offer from a developer. Good money. Could have moved us all to Charleston, gotten a job that didn't depend on weather and commodity prices. Henry's voice was thoughtful. Your mother never knew how close I came to taking it. What stopped you? One morning, I was out here trying to make my decision. Sarah's predecessor, Dr. Murray, was treating one of our horses. He said something that stuck with me. Said some people are meant for certain places, certain lives. That fighting it just leads to regret. James felt something shift in his chest. And you knew the farm was your place? I knew my life made sense here in a way it never would in Charleston. His father turned to look at him directly. The question is, son, where does your life make sense? Today, when that work crisis hit, James said slowly, I handled it. Fixed the problem, saved the deal. But it felt hollow. Like I was playing a part in someone else's story. And here on the farm? Here, even the hard days feel right. James ran a hand through his hair. When I'm working with Sarah, everything fits. Makes sense. Even when we're struggling with that damn milking machine or delivering cows at midnight. His father smiled. You should tell her that. I should have told her this morning. James pulled out his phone, Sarah's number already on the screen. I should have told her a lot of things. The call went straight to voicemail. Her professional greeting felt formal and distant after weeks of easy conversation. She's probably doing evening rounds, he said, trying to hide his disappointment. Or dealing with an emergency. Son, his father's voice was gentle but firm. Some things need to be said face to face. Words like that deserve more than a phone call. James stared at his phone, remembering Sarah's smile in the morning light, the way she understood both his drive for order and his growing love for island life. The way she'd quietly slipped away this morning when he'd gotten that call, giving him space he hadn't asked for and didn't really want. "You think I still have a chance to make this right?" "I think," his father said carefully, "that when something matters enough, you find a way." He squeezed James's shoulder. "And son? When you do find that way? Don't let go." James slipped his phone back in his pocket, resolution settling over him. "I need to see her tonight." "Might want to change first," his father said mildly, gesturing at James's hospital-rumpled clothes. "And check the clinic before driving all over the island looking for her. If she's anything like Dr. Murray, that's where you'll find her." The practical suggestions grounded him, giving shape to his determination. "Right. Yes." He started toward the house, then turned back. "Dad? Thanks." His father waved him off. "Just don't forget to tell your mother where you're going. She's liable to send out a search party if you disappear." Inside, James took the stairs 2 at a time, mind already racing ahead. He needed to tell Sarah about Charlotte, about the corporate crisis, about how seeing his tiny niece had clarified everything. How holding that small hand had made him realize what really mattered. He changed quickly into fresh clothes, then paused at his dresser where he'd tossed his wallet earlier. His Birmingham business card sat next to the handwritten schedule Sarah had made for Lincoln's care, corporate letterhead versus her practical veterinary scrawl. The contrast struck him as almost too perfect, his 2 lives, laid out in crisp type and warm handwriting. The lights were still on at Sarah's clinic when James pulled up. Through the window, he could see her at her desk, head bent over paperwork, her hair falling loose from its usual neat braid. Something in his chest tightened at the sight. She looked up, startled, when he knocked on the door. The surprise in her eyes made him realize how much he'd taken her constant presence for granted these past weeks. "James?" She unlocked the door, letting him in. "I thought you'd be at the hospital with your family." "We just got back." He followed her inside, noting the tired slope of her shoulders. "Your phone went to voicemail." "Oh." She checked it, frowning. "Dead battery." "It's been a crazy day, emergency surgery on Mr. Thompson's horse, then Max's bandage change turned complicated." She trailed off, straightening papers on her desk. "How's the baby? And Olivia?" "They're both doing well. Charlotte's tiny but strong." He watched her nod, still moving papers around. "I wanted to tell you earlier, but after that call from Birmingham." "James, it's fine." She gave him a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You had family matters to handle. And a work crisis." "I understand." But he could see it now, how she'd stepped back this morning, making herself smaller, less intrusive. How she'd given him space he hadn't wanted, trying not to complicate his already complex day. "Sarah," he said softly. "Stop." She stilled, finally meeting his eyes. "I just didn't want to get in the way. Your parents just got back, and with the baby, and your work calling. You could never be in the way." He stepped closer, then stopped himself, suddenly uncertain. Her professional demeanor felt like a wall between them. "I should have called, at least told you about Charlotte." "It's fine, really." Sarah turned back to her desk, creating distance. "I'm sure you had your hands full. And it was good to focus on work today." "I had quite a few appointments to catch up on." Her casual tone made his chest ache. Had he misread everything? Maybe these weeks of morning coffee and shared work had meant something different to her. Maybe he was just a temporary distraction, a holiday visitor to keep her company until he returned to his real life. Right. He shifted, suddenly unsure why he'd come. "I just wanted to make sure you knew about the baby. And to thank you for all your help with the farm." "Of course." Her smile was friendly but reserved. "That's what neighbors do, right?" Neighbors. The word felt like a slap. All his carefully planned words dried up in his throat. Right. Neighbors. He took a step back, the warmth of his earlier resolve cooling rapidly. "Well, I should let you get back to your paperwork." How long will you stay? She asked, shuffling files on her desk. On the island, I mean. Now that your parents are back. The question hung between them. He couldn't read her tone. Was she hoping he'd leave soon? Looking forward to getting back to her normal routine without him underfoot? I haven't decided. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Probably another email from Birmingham. The timing felt pointed, almost cruel. Things at the office are getting complicated. Of course they are. You have responsibilities there. Her voice was carefully neutral. Important work. Each word felt like another brick in the wall forming between them. Where was the Sarah who teased him about the milking machine? Who brought him coffee and shared quiet morning moments? The work will always be there, he said, trying one more time to bridge the growing gap. But Mr. Thompson's horse needs checking, she cut in, glancing at her watch. I should really. No, you're right. You're busy. He moved toward the door, pride and uncertainty tangling in his chest. I'll see you around, Dr. Walker. He thought he saw something flicker in her eyes at the formal address, but she just nodded. Good night, James. The drive home felt longer than the trip to Charleston had. His father's words echoed in his mind, when something matters enough, you find a way. But maybe he'd waited too long. Maybe Sarah had already decided he wasn't worth the complications he brought with him. The farmhouse lights glowed warmly as he pulled up, but James sat in his car for a long moment, letting the engine idle. His phone buzzed again, another message from Birmingham. He ignored it, remembering how easily he'd slipped back into corporate mode this morning, how quickly he'd let that world pull him away from what mattered. No wonder Sarah saw him as temporary. He'd done nothing to prove otherwise. That's what neighbors do. Her words echoed in his mind, each repetition stinging fresh. All those early mornings together, the shared jokes and quiet moments of connection, had they meant something different to her? Had he imagined the way she looked at him, the spark between them? He finally cut the engine, darkness settling around him like a weight. Through the kitchen window, he could see his parents at the table, probably planning tomorrow's hospital visit. His mother's care package would be restocked, his father's truck gassed up for another trip to Charleston. Their lives moved forward with clear purpose, while he sat here, caught between worlds. The barn stood dark and quiet, a stark reminder of their time together. Tomorrow she might show up with coffee, professional and pleasant, pretending this evening had never happened. The thought made his chest ache. James got out of the car, the cold December air biting at his face. He had decisions to make, about Birmingham, about the farm, about his future. But tonight, all he could think about was the careful distance in Sarah's eyes and the growing fear that he'd lost something precious before he'd even fully understood what it was. Chapter 9. Sarah yawned and unlocked the clinic doors. Christmas Eve or not, animals needed care. She'd already checked on her overnight patients. Mr. Thompson's horse was recovering nicely from colic, and the Jensen's new puppy was ready to go home after surgery. She tried to lose herself in routine tasks, inventory counts, supply orders, updating charts. Anything to keep from thinking about James's formal Dr. Walker 2 nights ago, or how naturally he'd slipped back into his Birmingham life at that first phone call. She should have known better. A few weeks of farm chores and shared coffee couldn't compete with the successful career he'd built. The church bulletin sat on her desk, tonight's Christmas Eve service circled in red. She'd been looking forward to it, but now the thought of watching him with his family, seeing him so clearly where he belonged, felt like too much. Better to stay home and watch a sappy Christmas movie. For now, she'd keep busy here at the clinic. There were always charts to update, supplies to organize. She carefully avoided looking at the neatly labeled shelves he'd arranged. The sound of car doors closing pulled her from her thoughts. Through the window, she saw Miss Doris helping Miss Betty from her car, a cat carrier between them. "I'm so sorry to bother you on Christmas Eve," Miss Betty said the moment Sarah opened the door. She cradled the carrier protectively. "But Mr. Whiskers got into the tinsel, and he's been acting strange all morning." He hasn't eaten since yesterday, Miss Doris added, ushering her friend inside. And you know how he usually is about his food. Sarah helped them settle Mr. Whiskers on the exam table. The elderly black and white cat gave her a baleful look as she began her examination. Now then, let's see what trouble you've gotten yourself into, she murmured, gently palpating his abdomen. The cat was clearly uncomfortable, but there was no severe distension. A good sign. I shouldn't have put up a tree this year, Miss Betty fretted. But he's never bothered with the decorations before. Cats can surprise you, even after years of good behavior. Sarah kept her touch gentle but thorough. Sometimes they just can't resist something shiny. Like some people we know, Miss Doris said with meaning in her voice that made Sarah glance up. But the older woman was seemingly focused on stroking Mr. Whisker's head. The good news is, I don't feel any blockage, Sarah said, returning her attention to her patient. But I'd like to do some x-rays to be sure. He might have just irritated his digestive system, but with tinsel we need to be careful. Of course, whatever you need to do. Miss Betty wrung her hands. I feel terrible bringing this to you today of all days. That's what she's here for, Miss Doris said firmly. Though I imagine you had other plans for Christmas Eve? Sarah busied herself preparing for the x-ray. Nothing special. Just catching up on paperwork. Paperwork? On Christmas Eve? Miss Doris's tone was carefully neutral. I thought you might be attending the service tonight. The Winter family always sits in the third pew on the left. Have for generations. Sarah's hand stilled for just a moment. I have patients to monitor, she said, keeping her voice professional. Now, let's get these x-rays done so we can get Mr. Whiskers feeling better. The x-rays showed no sign of tinsel obstruction, allowing Sarah to breathe a little easier. She was explaining the images to Miss Betty and Miss Doris when Mr. Whiskers started making that distinctive retching sound familiar to all cat owners. Oh. Miss Betty stepped back as the cat hunched over on the exam table. Is he? A moment later, a rather impressive hairball appeared, along with a few strands of tinsel. Well, Miss Doris said dryly, I guess that solves that mystery. Miss Betty's face flamed red. All this fuss, and it was just a hairball. Sarah, I'm so sorry to have bothered you with. It was the right call to bring him in, Sarah assured her, already cleaning up. With tinsel involved, we needed to be sure. And he clearly wasn't feeling well. She gave Mr. Whiskers another gentle exam. His stomach feels much better now. I'll send you home with something to help prevent future hairballs, but I think your fellow here will be just fine. The cat, looking quite pleased with himself, began to purr. Though he should probably still stay away from the Christmas tree, Sarah added, unable to hold back a smile. I'll keep him out of the living room, Miss Betty promised. Now about your plans for tonight, Miss Doris began. I really should get back to those charts, Sarah said, gathering Mr. Whisker's paperwork. And you two should get this fellow home and settled. But the Christmas Eve service? I'm pretty sure it'll be going on just fine without me there. Sarah managed a smile as she walked them to the door. Besides, someone needs to be available for pet emergencies. Even on holidays. Humph. Miss Doris didn't look convinced, but she helped Miss Betty gather her things. At least promise you'll think about it? I promise to think about it, Sarah said diplomatically, holding the door. Now get this troublemaker home before he finds more mischief. She watched through the window as Miss Doris helped Miss Betty into the car, Mr. Whiskers secure in his pet carrier. The two women were still clearly discussing something, probably her stubborn insistence on working tonight, as they pulled away. She was just turning back to her desk when another car pulled into the lot. Her heart stuttered when she recognized James's BMW. For a moment, she considered pretending she hadn't seen him, retreating to the back of the clinic. But he'd already spotted her through the window, and something in his expression made her pause. He looked determined. And maybe a little nervous. Sarah glanced at her reflection in the window. Her hair was escaping its braid, her scrubs were slightly rumpled from wrestling with Mr. Whiskers. Not exactly how she'd wanted to look when she next saw him, but then again, He'd seen her covered in hay and worse since that first night in the barn. She took a deep breath and moved to unlock the door. Her hand hesitated on the handle for just a moment before professional instinct took over. "Is everything okay?" she asked, doctor mode engaging automatically. "Did something happen at the farm?" "Everything's fine at the farm," James said quickly. "I just saw Miss Betty leaving." "Emergency?" "Hairball crisis." Sarah stepped back, letting him in but maintaining careful distance. "Nothing serious." "On Christmas Eve." He smiled slightly. "That cat has terrible timing. Animals rarely check the calendar before getting into trouble." She moved behind her desk, using it as a barrier. "Was there something you needed?" "Not exactly." He shifted, looking less certain than he had a moment ago. "I wanted to see you." "Why?" she asked, hoping it wasn't to say goodbye. She wasn't good with those. "I wasn't sure you'd be here until I saw Miss Betty leaving." He shook his head. "Here you are. Alone. On Christmas Eve. Someone has to be available for pet emergencies." She shuffled some papers, not meeting his eyes. "Even on holidays." "Sarah." The way he said her name made her look up. "Why are you here?" She hadn't meant for it to come out so sharp, but the memory of that formal Dr. Walker still stung. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as frustration. "Because I hate this. This distance between us. The way you've been pulling back since my parents returned." "I haven't been." "You have. And I get it. That morning, when Birmingham called, I just switched modes. Let everything else fall away. Let you fall away." He took a step closer to the desk. "I hate that I made you feel like you didn't belong in my world." Sarah's heart thundered in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "James, you don't have to." "Yes, I do. Because you've become important to me, Sarah. In ways that surprised me. In ways that make Birmingham feel less and less like home." "James." Sarah moved from behind her desk but kept her distance. "Maybe we're both just getting caught up in the holiday spirit. It's easy to feel things this time of year. When everyone else seems to be with family." "Is that what you think this is?" He stepped closer. "Holiday loneliness? Isn't it?" She grabbed her coat, needing movement. "I need to lock up for lunch anyway. Walk with me?" The winter sun was surprisingly warm as they stepped outside, the town square festive with garlands and ribbons. Christmas music drifted from the bakery, and the large tree in the center of the square sparkled even in daylight. "You want to know what I think this is?" James asked as they fell into step together. "I think it's morning coffee and shared jokes about the milking machine. It's the way you know exactly when to push me and when to step back. It's how right it feels, working beside you, even when everything's going wrong." Sarah's throat tightened. "James. Let me finish." They passed the bookstore, its windows frosted with painted snowflakes. "When I first came home, I thought I was just running away from Birmingham, from everything that happened there. But being here, with you, I wasn't running away. I was running towards something. Someone." "And what happens after the holidays?" The words came out barely above a whisper. "When Birmingham calls again?" "Birmingham will always call." He stopped walking, turning to face her. The Christmas lights strung between lampposts caught in his dark hair. "But I'm done letting it pull me away from what matters." "What matters is your career." Sarah forced herself to meet his eyes. "The life you've built there. I won't be the reason you give that up." "You think that's what this is? Me giving something up?" The tenderness in his voice made her chest ache. "Sarah, these past weeks with you, working the farm, helping neighbors, being part of this community, it's shown me what I really want. What really matters." They'd reached the gazebo in the town square, its white railings wrapped in evergreen garlands. Sarah sat on one of the benches, needing a moment to steady herself. "I've been so careful," she admitted. Keeping my distance, telling myself not to read too much into our time together. That you were just being kind, helping out while Ethan was away. James sat beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth. And now? Now? She watched a pair of cardinals land on the Christmas tree, bright against the dark branches. Now I'm terrified that I'm reading too much into this moment. That tomorrow you'll go back to being the successful Birmingham lawyer, and I'll be the island vet who patches up farm animals and delivers calves at midnight. What if I told you I've been looking into office space on the island? His words made her turn sharply to look at him. What if I told you that holding Charlotte made me realize I want to be here for all her firsts? That every time I look at those color-coded labels in the barn, I imagine building a life here? With you? Sarah's breath caught. You're serious about this? I'm serious about all of it. He turned toward her, his eyes holding hers. About staying, about building a practice here. About you. The winter sun warmed them through the gazebo's latticed roof, and somewhere nearby, church bells began to chime. It felt like a moment out of a Christmas movie, the decorations, the music drifting from nearby shops, the way James was looking at her like she was the only person in the world. I've missed you, she admitted softly. These past few days, not having our morning coffee, not sharing jokes about the milking machine. I've missed you too. His hand found hers, fingers intertwining naturally. More than I thought possible. She could feel her walls crumbling, all her careful professional distance melting away like frost in sunlight. James. He reached up with his free hand, brushing a strand of hair from her face. The touch was achingly gentle, full of promise. Sarah leaned into it slightly, her heart thundering in her chest. No more pulling away, he murmured, drawing closer. No more switching to lawyer mode, she countered, but she was smiling. His answering grin was all the response she needed. When his lips met hers, soft and sure, time seemed to slow. The winter sun warmed her face, but James's touch was warmer, his hand cradling her cheek, his thumb brushing softly across her skin. He tasted like coffee and promise, familiar and new all at once. The scent of pine from the gazebo's garlands mixed with his aftershave, wrapping around them like a cocoon. Somewhere in the distance, the church bells finished their song, the last notes fading into the December morning. But Sarah barely noticed, too caught up in the gentle way James drew her closer, in how perfectly they fit together. When they finally parted, she kept her eyes closed for a moment, savoring the lingering sweetness. James rested his forehead against hers, his breath warm against her lips, his hand still curved around her face like she was something precious. I've wanted to do that since the first time you explained the milking machine to me, he murmured. Sarah laughed softly, opening her eyes to find him watching her with such tenderness it made her heart flip. Even when I was teasing you about holding it wrong? Especially then. Sarah's laugh faded into a contented sigh as James drew her closer, wrapping her in his warmth. The world felt perfectly aligned, the gentle winter sun, the holiday decorations sparkling around them, the solid presence of the man who'd worked his way into her heart one morning coffee at a time. I love you, she whispered, then froze as she realized what she'd said. The words had slipped out unbidden, natural as breathing, but far too soon. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Sarah. James pulled back just enough to meet her eyes, his expression so tender it made her throat tight. I love you too. Have for a while now, I think. Maybe since that night we delivered Lincoln. Really? Her voice wavered slightly. Really? His smile was soft, certain. Though watching you organize my labels and tease me about the milking machine definitely sealed the deal. She laughed, the sound catching on something that felt suspiciously like a happy sob. Those are terrible reasons to love someone. They're perfect reasons. He brushed away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. They're us. They sat together in the gazebo, Sarah's head resting on James's shoulder, neither wanting to break the spell of the moment. His thumb traced gentle circles on her hand, and she marveled at how natural this felt, like they'd been doing this forever, like they'd do this forever. I should get back to the clinic, she said finally, though she made no move to leave. In case of more hairball emergencies. James chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. Will you come to the service tonight? Planning to save me a seat in that third pew on the left? She smiled, remembering Miss Doris's words. Planning to save you a seat next to me anywhere you want. He pressed a kiss to her temple. For as long as you'll let me. They walked back toward the clinic hand in hand, the winter sun warming their faces. The town square had come alive with last-minute shoppers and families enjoying the decorations. Sarah felt like she was floating, wrapped in the kind of happiness she'd only read about in Christmas stories. Merry Christmas, you too. Mrs. Caldwell called from the bakery doorway, her knowing smile suggesting their gazebo moment hadn't gone unnoticed. Merry Christmas, they called back in unison, then caught each other's eye and laughed. Some choices, Sarah thought as they reached the clinic, really were that simple after all. Sarah sat on the couch next to James, still wearing her church dress, surrounded by the warm glow of Christmas tree lights and family. The formal Dr. Walker of a few days ago felt like a distant memory, erased by James holding her hand through the service and Maggie insisting she join them afterward. Henry fiddled with the laptop, adjusting its position on the coffee table. Can everyone see the screen? Is the tree in frame? Ethan said they're ready whenever we are. It's perfect, dear. Maggie straightened a bough on a nearby branch, then settled into her chair. Though I still say we should have waited to open presents until they're home. Which is exactly why we're calling now. Ethan's voice came through the speakers as his face appeared on screen. The camera shifted, and suddenly they could see Olivia in her hospital bed, looking tired but happy, with a tiny bundle in her arms. Is that our girl? Maggie leaned forward, eager for a better view. Oh, look how much hair she has. She's getting stronger every day, Olivia said, adjusting the blanket so they could see Charlotte's face. The doctors are amazed at her progress. Speaking of progress, Ethan's grin widened. How would everyone feel about a New Year's Day dinner? All of us, together at the farm? The room erupted in excited voices. Sarah felt James squeeze her hand, his joy palpable. She squeezed back, remembering how recently she'd thought she didn't belong in moments like this. Really? Maggie's eyes filled with tears. You'll all be home? Charlotte's doing well, Olivia said, pride evident in her voice. She's feeding well, gaining weight. As long as she keeps it up, they'll release us on the 30th. Your rooms are all ready, Maggie said quickly. I've been airing it out, and Sarah helped me set up the bassinet. Found it, Henry corrected with a wink at Sarah. She found it in the attic, tucked away since James was a baby. And supervised while I cleaned it properly, Sarah added, making everyone laugh. The camera moved closer to Charlotte, who yawned widely, showing off tiny pink gums. Someone's ready for her evening feeding, Olivia said softly. But we wanted you all to know first. It's the best Christmas present we could have hoped for. Better than anything under that tree, Henry agreed, his voice rough with emotion. Though speaking of presents, Ethan said, we might have spotted some suspicious packages being delivered to the hospital. Mom, did you really need to order from every baby boutique in Charleston? Of course she did, James said, his thumb tracing circles on Sarah's palm. How else would Charlotte know she's the most spoiled granddaughter in South Carolina? On the East Coast, Maggie corrected primly, making them all laugh again. They talked a while longer, making plans for New Year's dinner, discussing Charlotte's progress, sharing stories about the Christmas Eve service. Sarah sat in the warm circle of James's arm, watching this family that had somehow become hers, marveling at how perfectly everything had fallen into place. When the call ended, Maggie disappeared into the kitchen, returning with a tray of hot chocolate, complete with tiny marshmallows and peppermint sticks. An old winter family tradition, she explained, handing Sarah a mug. Christmas Eve cocoa after service. With extra marshmallows for the vet who's been taking care of all of us, Henry added with a warmth that made Sarah's chest tight. Speaking of taking care, Maggie settled back in her chair, cradling her own mug. James tells us you're working tomorrow morning? Just for a few hours, Sarah said. Morning rounds, checking on the overnight patients. Then you'll join us for Christmas dinner? It wasn't really a question. James mentioned you usually spend the holiday at the clinic. Sarah felt James tense slightly beside her, probably remembering their conversation about holiday loneliness, but Maggie's invitation held nothing but genuine warmth. I'd love to, she said softly. Thank you. Don't thank us, Henry said. It's nice having our children home for the holidays. Especially our oldest. The simple inclusion, so casually offered, made Sarah's eyes sting. James pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. Though we might need your professional expertise, Maggie added with twinkling eyes. James mentioned something about color-coding the Christmas dinner preparations? Mom, James groaned, but he was smiling. What? I thought it was a wonderful system. Very, what did you call it, Henry? Methodical? Meticulous, Henry corrected, sharing an amused look with his wife. The easy teasing, the warmth of inclusion, the way they'd so naturally woven her into their family tapestry, it was everything Sarah had feared to hope for. She curled closer to James, breathing in the mingled scents of pine needles, hot chocolate, and home. The evening wound down slowly, wrapped in the gentle magic of Christmas Eve. Henry told stories about the boys' childhood holidays, while Maggie added details about each ornament on the tree, many of them handmade by her sons over the years. And this one, she said, pointing to a slightly lopsided star, James made the year he decided to become a lawyer. He was so proud of it because he'd written attorney all by himself. Even if he spelled it wrong, Henry chuckled. James groaned good-naturedly. I was 8. Sarah studied the ornament, imagining a young James carefully crafting it, unaware that his path would eventually lead him back home. Back to the island, to the farm, to her. As if reading her thoughts, James squeezed her hand. Next year you'll have to add one of your own to the tree. Already planning next Christmas, she teased, but her heart swelled at the certainty in his voice. Planning every Christmas, he murmured, just for her. Right here on the island, with you. Later, as James walked her to her truck, the night was alive with possibility. Christmas lights twinkled across the farm, and in the distance, church bells began to toll midnight. Sarah thought about everything that had brought her here, leaving Atlanta, finding her place on the island, falling in love with a lawyer who'd found his way home. What are you thinking about? James asked, pulling her close. About how sometimes the best gifts are the ones you never thought to wish for. She looked up at him, at the farm, at the life they were building together. About how right this feels. His kiss was soft, full of promise. Above them, stars sparkled in the clear December sky, and somewhere in the barn, Lincoln lowed softly, a reminder of where their story had begun. Merry Christmas, Sarah, James whispered against her lips. Merry Christmas, she replied, knowing that this was just the beginning of their island story. Epilogue. Palmar Island 1 year later. James pulled into the farmhouse drive just as the sun was clearing the horizon, reaching across the console to squeeze Sarah's hand. Christmas morning light painted the familiar scene in shades of gold, the barn where they'd first connected, the fence where they'd shared countless conversations, the porch where he'd finally found the courage to tell her he was staying for good. Your mom's really gone all out this year, Sarah said, taking in the elaborate Christmas lights and garlands adorning every surface. Charlotte's first real Christmas at the farm, James reminded her. She's been planning this since July. They'd barely reached the porch when the door flew open, revealing Ethan with Charlotte balanced on his hip. Uncle James. Aunt Sarah, he mimicked his daughter's excited babble, making them laugh. There's our girl, Sarah held out her arms, and Charlotte practically launched herself toward her favorite aunt. Ready to show me all your new tricks? Inside, the house was alive with Christmas morning chaos. Their mother had outdone herself with breakfast, the kitchen counter laden with cinnamon rolls, fruit, and what looked like enough bacon to feed a small army. His father sat in his usual chair, already deep in conversation with Mark about some new telescope, while Olivia arranged presents under the tree. Watch this, Ethan said proudly, setting Charlotte on the floor. She immediately took off on hands and knees, making a beeline for the Christmas tree. Oh no you don't, sweet pea. James scooped her up just before she reached the lowest branches. She giggled, patting his face with tiny hands that somehow still smelled like the vanilla lotion Sarah had given Olivia for the baby. The back door opened, letting in a burst of cold air along with Daniel and Ava, their cheeks pink from the short walk from their cottage. Mark and Lena followed close behind, carrying what looked like even more presents. "Something smells amazing," Daniel announced, making a beeline for the coffee pot. "Hands off those cinnamon rolls until everyone's seated," Maggie warned, swatting his reaching fingers. "And save some coffee for your brothers." "Too late," Mark grinned, already pouring cups for himself and Lena. "Though I might be persuaded to share if someone takes these packages off my hands." "Here, I'll help," Sarah offered. She and Lena disappeared into the living room with the gifts, while James grabbed mugs for himself and Ava. "The Christmas Eve service was beautiful last night," Lena called from the other room. "Though I still can't believe you all managed to keep Daniel in a suit for that long." "Anything for Mom," Daniel said, finally succeeding in snagging a piece of bacon. "Even formal wear." Speaking of formal wear, Maggie emerged from the pantry with another tray of rolls. James actually wore a tie. "Only because Sarah threatened to withhold morning coffee if I didn't," James admitted, pulling Sarah close as she returned to the kitchen. "Someone has to keep you in line," she teased, stealing a bite of Daniel's purloined bacon. "All right everyone," Henry stood, lifting his coffee mug. "Let's get seated before these boys clean out the kitchen. Charlotte's been patient long enough." They gathered around the table, passing plates and pouring coffee, the familiar chaos of family breakfast amplified by holiday excitement. Charlotte bounced in her high chair, more interested in grabbing at the sparkly ribbon in Ava's hair than the bits of cinnamon roll Olivia was trying to feed her. James looked around the table, at his brothers and their partners, at his parents beaming with pride, at Sarah fitting so perfectly into this scene, and felt his heart swell. This, he thought, was exactly where they all belonged. James caught Sarah's eye across the table, receiving her small nod. They'd planned to wait until after breakfast, but watching his family together like this, happy, whole, exactly where they belonged, the moment felt right. He cleared his throat, his hand finding Sarah's under the table. "Actually, before we dig into these cinnamon rolls, Sarah and I have something to share." Sarah reached up with her free hand, pulling a delicate chain from beneath her sweater. His grandmother's ring caught the morning light as she slipped it onto her finger. "Finally!" Daniel exclaimed before anyone else could speak. "I was starting to think he'd never ask." "You knew?" Maggie's voice wavered with happy tears. "We all knew," Mark laughed. "He asked Dad for Grandma's ring last month. Worst kept secret on the island." "That's not true," Ava protested. "Miss Doris doesn't know yet." "Actually." Sarah's cheeks flushed pink. "She might have helped him plan the proposal." "Of course she did," Olivia said, wiping Charlotte's sticky fingers. "Nothing happens on this island without Miss Doris knowing about it." Charlotte, picking up on the excitement, let out a happy squeal and threw a piece of cinnamon roll that landed squarely in Daniel's coffee. "Thanks for that, Princess," he said dryly, but he was grinning. "So, big brother, how'd you do it? Please tell me it was appropriately romantic and not just some color-coded presentation about the benefits of marriage." "It was actually pretty perfect," Sarah said softly, her fingers intertwining with James's. "Though there might have been a spreadsheet involved." "I knew it," Daniel crowed. "In my defense," James said, "the spreadsheet was just to track feeding times for the new calf. I had it all planned out differently, but... Lena leaned forward, clearly invested in the story. "But Sarah got called out for an emergency at midnight. One of the Thompsons' horses was colicking. And as I watched her work, so confident and caring, knowing exactly what to do." James squeezed her hand, remembering that moment with perfect clarity. "I couldn't wait for the elaborate plan. The ring was in my pocket, and suddenly it just felt right." "He proposed in the barn at 3 a.m, Sarah said, her eyes shining. "After we knew the horse would be okay." "With hay in your hair and probably smelling like horse?" Ava asked. "It was perfect," Sarah insisted. Just us, and the animals, and the Christmas lights he never took down from last year. And the spreadsheet, Danielle added helpfully. And the spreadsheet, James admitted, making everyone laugh. Though I did manage to be a little romantic. Tell them what I said. Sarah's smile softened. He said that somewhere between morning coffee and midnight emergencies, he'd found his home. Not just on the island, but with me. Oh, James. Maggie dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. Charlotte chose that moment to reach for Sarah, nearly appending her breakfast in the process. Bah, she declared firmly. I think that's baby for congratulations, Ethan translated, steadying his daughter's chair. So, Lena leaned forward, eyes sparkling, when's the wedding? Before either James or Sarah could respond, Daniel jumped in. Please tell me you're doing it here at the farm. I've already got ideas for the barn. Let them answer, Maggie chided, though James could see her own eagerness for details. Actually, Sarah began, but Charlotte interrupted with another squeal, this time successfully grabbing the ribbon from Ava's hair. Here, let me, James offered, rescuing the ribbon while Olivia tried to redirect their daughter's attention to her breakfast. You're going to need practice with that, Mark observed. Especially if you're planning a summer wedding. Charlotte will be walking by then, you know. Henry caught James's eye across the table, his expression knowing. They'd talked about this, late one night after James had asked for the ring. About timing, and seasons, and family traditions. Whatever you decide, his father said quietly, it'll be perfect. Sarah squeezed James's hand under the table, and he felt that familiar surge of certainty. The same feeling he'd had that night in the barn, ring in his pocket, watching her save a horse and his heart all at once. Actually, Sarah glanced at James, a smile playing at her lips, we've already decided. Really? Maggie perked up, coffee cup forgotten in her hands. James nodded. New Year's Eve. There was a moment of stunned silence, broken only by Charlotte happily mushing a piece of cinnamon roll. This New Year's Eve? Ava asked. As in, next week? We don't want to wait, James said simply. And what better way to start the new year? But that's so soon. Maggie set down her cup. There's so much to plan. It's all handled, Mom. James smiled at Sarah. Miss Doris has been secretly planning since the moment I asked for Grandma's ring. The church is booked, Sarah already has her dress. And the reception will be here in the barn, Sarah added quickly. Nothing fancy, just family and close friends. The way island weddings should be. Plus, Daniel grinned, you know the whole town will show up anyway. It's not every day the prodigal son marries the island vet. He's not wrong, Mark said. Though a week isn't much notice. On Palmar Island? Olivia laughed, wiping Charlotte's sticky face. The whole town probably knew about this before we did. I bet Miss Doris already has the menu planned. She does, Sarah admitted. And she's making the cake. Of course she is. Maggie's eyes were wet again, but she was smiling. A New Year's Eve wedding. It's perfect. Friends of Miss Doris will be decorating the church, Sarah said. Though they think it's for the New Year's service. And Joel's agreed to sing, James added. Which reminds me, Daniel, your sound equipment. Say no more, his brother waved him off. Ava and I have got the music covered. Consider it our wedding gift. And the flowers? Maggie asked, already in full planning mode. Chloe has us covered, Sarah said. White flowers and evergreens, simple but elegant. Charlotte punctuated this by offering Sarah a thoroughly squished piece of cinnamon roll. Thank you, sweet girl. Sarah accepted the sticky gift with perfect seriousness. Maybe you can help Aunt Chloe with the flowers. James watched his family fall into excited wedding discussion, Lena and Ava already planning decorations for the barn, Mark offering to handle the photography, his mother mentally rearranging furniture to accommodate guests. Sarah caught his eye across the chaos, her smile radiant. This time last year, he'd been lost, searching for home. Now, surrounded by family on Christmas morning, watching Sarah field wedding questions while wearing his grandmother's ring, he knew with absolute certainty that he'd found it. "Ready for this?" he asked softly. Sarah's answer was interrupted by Charlotte crawling into her lap, leaving sticky fingerprints on her sweater. "More than ready," she said, cuddling her future niece close. "For all of it." Outside, snow began to fall, a rare Christmas miracle on Palmar Island, adding its own magic to the promise of the week ahead. The church bells chimed 5 o'clock as James adjusted his tie in the back room. Through the window, he could see the island community streaming in, drawn by the glow of candlelight and the promise of a celebration no one had officially announced but everyone somehow knew about. "Ready?" Ethan asked. Charlotte balanced on his hip in her tiny white dress. She reached for James with sticky fingers. How she'd managed to get sticky before the ceremony was anyone's guess. More than ready. And he was. The nerves he'd expected never materialized. Instead, there was only certainty, peace, and an eagerness to begin this next chapter with Sarah. The church glowed with hundreds of candles, evergreen garlands draped along the pews. Sophie's clear voice filled the space with "O Holy Night," Sarah's favorite Christmas song. As James took his place at the front, he caught sight of Miss Doris dabbing her eyes, already emotional though the ceremony hadn't even started. But all thoughts fled when the doors opened and Sarah appeared. She wore a simple white dress that seemed to catch and hold all the candlelight, her hair swept up with tiny white flowers. Their eyes met across the church, and James felt his heart stop, then restart, fuller than before. When it came time for their vows, Sarah's voice was clear and steady. "James, you came home to find yourself, but in doing so, you helped me find where I belong. Between morning coffee and midnight emergencies, between color-coded charts and messy farm life, you showed me that home isn't a place, it's a person. It's you. I promise to be your partner in all things, to face every challenge and celebrate every joy together, and to bring you coffee every morning for the rest of our lives." James had to clear his throat before he could speak, emotion making his voice rough. "Sarah, a year ago I thought I was running away from my old life. Instead, I was running toward you. You taught me that sometimes the best gifts are the ones we never thought to wish for. I promise to be worthy of the trust you place in me, to support your dreams as you've supported mine, and to love you through every season of our life together. Morning coffee optional." Their laughter mingled with happy tears as they exchanged rings. The candlelight caught on the delicate gold bands, symbols of promises made and kept. When they were pronounced husband and wife, the kiss they shared felt like a beginning. Joel's voice soared with joy to the world as they walked back down the aisle, past smiling faces and happy tears, into the crisp evening air. "Ready for the party, Mrs. Winter?" James murmured as they waited for their guests to file out. "Dr. Walker Winter," she corrected with a smile. "Though I suppose I'll answer to either." The short drive to the farm felt surreal, Christmas lights and stars guiding their way. When they pulled up to the barn, James caught his breath. Daniel and Ava had outdone themselves. The entire structure glowed from within, white lights and evergreen garlands transforming it into something magical. Inside, tables draped in white linens circled a dance floor. Paper whites and pine boughs filled silver vessels, their fragrance mixing with the scent of Miss Doris's famous vanilla cake. Chloe had woven white roses through the rafters, and tiny lights twinkled everywhere like captured stars. "It's perfect," Sarah whispered, squeezing his hand. The evening passed in a blur of congratulations and laughter. Charlotte toddled from table to table, collecting kisses and dropping flower petals. Miss Doris held court near the cake, telling anyone who would listen how she'd known all along they were meant for each other. Their brothers took turns teasing them in toasts that somehow managed to be both hilarious and touching. As midnight approached, Daniel dimmed the lights and Mark announced their first dance. James led Sarah to the center of the floor as soft music filled the barn. The opening notes of "What a Wonderful World" filled the barn, Sarah's favorite, though he hadn't told her he'd chosen it. Her smile when she recognized it made his heart flip, even now. "Good choice," she murmured as he pulled her close. They swayed together, the world narrowing to just this moment, Sarah in his arms, their family and friends gathered around them, the promise of a new year and a shared lifetime ahead. 10 minutes to midnight. Daniel called out, and James felt Sarah laugh softly against his chest. "Should we tell them about Daniel's surprise?" she whispered. "And ruin his moment?" "Never." James pressed a kiss to her temple. "Though I still can't believe he got the permit." "Please," Sarah pulled back to look at him, eyes sparkling. "Your brother could charm permits out of anyone. Besides, the harbor master loves him." More couples joined them on the dance floor, his parents, his brothers, and their partners, even Miss Doris. Charlotte had finally fallen asleep in Olivia's arms, tiny fingers clutching one of the paper whites. 5 minutes. The countdown began, excitement building. James held Sarah closer, remembering last New Year's Eve when he'd been alone in Birmingham, not yet knowing his life was about to change. 1 minute. 10, 9, 8. The crowd counted down together, voices rising with excitement. James and Sarah moved toward the barn doors, where their family was gathering. 7, 6, 5. Sarah's hand found his, warm and sure. Forever, he thought, suddenly struck by the magnitude of that promise. 4, 3, 2. "I love you," he whispered, just for her. 1. "Happy New Year." Their midnight kiss was interrupted by the first explosion of fireworks, painting the island sky in brilliant colors. Daniel had outdone himself, each burst more spectacular than the last, reflecting off the harbor waters and casting rainbow lights across the snow that still lingered from Christmas. They stood in the barn doorway, Sarah wrapped in his arms, watching the display. Their family clustered around them, Charlotte awake now and squealing with delight, their parents holding hands like newlyweds themselves, their brothers and their loves all together. "Beautiful," Sarah said softly, but when James looked down, she wasn't watching the fireworks. Her eyes were on him, full of love and promise. "Happy New Year, Dr. Walker Winter." "Happy New Year, Mr. Winter." Above them, the fireworks painted the sky with light and color, but James knew the real magic wasn't in the display. It was here, in the woman in his arms, in the family surrounding them, in the life they'd built together on this island that had given them both a home. Some gifts, after all, were better than anything they could have wished for. The end. This has been a Christmas Homecoming. Written by Susanne Ash. Copyright 2024 by Susanne Ash. Production copyright 2024 by Susanne Ash. Thanks for listening. Please like and subscribe if you want me to put more of my books on YouTube. Visit my website at www.susanneash.com for more of my books or find me on Amazon.